Day of, thank you. Welcome to the third day of EnVision 2021, the next generation. We've got a fantastic lineup of speakers today. I'm really excited to hear them. Before we do that, I want to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. What we have today are four excellent speakers, but before I present to you those speakers, I actually just want to briefly point out that we also have some excellent student presentations that you can find online. If you go to our website, you've received this website in multiple emails. On the top right corner, you've got student presentations, and there are three presentations from Andrew Freiberger, Christopher Tremblay, and Grace Timon. And I've watched these videos. They're very short. They're full of information. They're just about 3 minutes. So if you go to our website there, you can check out these fantastic presentations on what else is going on outside of the presentations that you're going to see today. So without further ado, I want to start off with Dr. Thomas Burdyny, who is an IESVic alum after he received his bachelor's and master's in mechanical engineering at UVic. Tom then completed his PhD in photocatalytic and electrocatalytic conversion of CO2 at the University of Toronto, and now he has moved on to become an assistant professor at Delft University of Technology. His group at the E-Refinery Institute researches operando techniques, catalyst development, electrochemical engineering, and transport analysis of electrochemical systems. So I really look forward to learning more about his topic, catalytic conversion of CO2 into chemicals and fuels, challenges and opportunities. Tom, please take it away.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. I haven't been able to make an EnVision conference before, but the online setting is absolutely perfect for it. So as introduced, my research and topic I'll be discussing today is in CO2 utilization, specifically through the use of electrolyzer technologies. To give a framework for where I've been, it was kind of a 2005 to 2013. I was in University of Victoria. I'm actually from Victoria originally. And if I keep moving west or east at the same pace, I'll end up back in Victoria in about 20 years or so, I think. My research interests are mainly around climate change mitigation technologies, much more in a lab scale working with individual technologies, but then also kind of looking at more large scale system-based analyses. To give an idea of what CO2 electrolysis is, which is the main topic my lab is looking into, much like water electrolysis, you can apply electrons with an appropriate catalyst and an appropriate environment to convert carbon dioxide and water into a variety of different chemicals. So you can directly produce methane, which you can imagine could be used for a number of different processes. You can produce carbon monoxide, which is a typical building block for different chemicals feedstocks. And you can also actually directly produce ethylene. Let's get my pointer up. You can directly produce ethylene. And once you kind of have these different base molecules, you can go through a variety of processes. So you can produce a lot of smaller scale chemicals. There's a lot of chemicals on the scale of say 1 to 2 megatons per year globally, based on CO. And then you can also combine your carbon monoxide with hydrogen to go through a number of different traditional thermochemical routes. So you can go through methanol synthesis routes, you can do Fischer-Tropsch synthesis, and you can do get diesel fuel out of this as well. And then similarly, if we can make ethylene with our CO2 electrolysis units, then we can go directly through polymerization to gasoline, as well as making plastics. So in terms of CO2 electrolysis, if you talk to most of the field, this is kind of the scope they look at, really just looking at the catalyst. How can we create new, more efficient catalysts? But our group really looks kind of on the grander scale. So from the catalyst to more one-dimensional transport, to upscaling, and then how that device fits within a larger, grander process. So the goal of our lab is to really try and increase the TRL levels of low temperature CO2 electrolyzers by looking across scales. And just to give a very brief overview of the group, we have a number of PhDs and postdocs working in this area, and then a whole wide variety of different aspects. And I've been doing 1D, 2D transport modeling since my master's at EnVision, and I'm happy to say that we still use that on a weekly basis in our lab as well. But I won't be talking about the very specific parts of our technology, so I won't be going into the nitty-gritty aspects of the CO2 electrolyzer, but more zooming out and saying how can CO2 electrolyzers and water electrolyzers try to decarbonize parts of the economy that are, let's say, hard to decarbonize. So specifically, I think of these as non-electrifiable emissions. So I take let's say, a very energy perspective to the climate change problem. If we take a very, very simplified Sankey diagram, if you will, we have, say, our primary energy sources here on the left, say around 18 terawatts, if I remember correctly. But then on the right is essentially where it goes inside our economy. And this is something Andrew presented on day one. And then you can more or less say, follow this and say, if we want to remove natural gas, well, we can do some electrification. We can heat our homes with, say, resistive heating. And then we need to somehow replace natural gas in the industrial sector. But if we were to kind of think of this in a simplistic point of view, we essentially need to get our society like this, where we have our renewable energy technologies, as well as some measures of, say, sequestration. But then we're stuck with what we have, what we use in our society. So unless our society, as I say, regresses or completely changes how we base our society, we're going to be stuck with these end uses. So if we look at our energy forms on the left, we have intermittent and steady forms. And then on the right, we'll have our mixture. So we'll have our pure electricity that we prefer to have when we need it and when we want it. We have our residential commercial sector with heat and electricity. But then when we look at the industrial sector and transportation, we're kind of stuck with these chemical bonds. And then hopefully over time, electricity can, say, eat away at the transportation sector. But we're always going to have some amount of non-electrifiable emissions from chemical bonds. And these are to make the plastics in our society, say kerosene for jet fuel, all the different kind of lab chemicals we use, even, for example. And we're going to need to find a way around that using renewable energy. So I just put a few of the main ones that we look at in our research area, and that's really kind of large scale chemicals in the greater than 100 megatons per year globally. And one of the main reasons we look at this in the Netherlands is, I believe, about 30 to 35% of Dutch emissions are actually through refining of chemicals, as well as transport of chemicals. The port of Rotterdam is I think still the biggest port in Europe, but it used to be the biggest port in the world about 20 years ago. So in the Dutch sector, it's quite an important thing. However, to get from, let's say, our energy forms to our end uses, we really need something in the middle. That thing in the middle can be a form of storage. It can be a catalytic system. It's transportation. We always have to have, let's say, our energy technologies, our core energy technologies within this middle region. So if we look at, let's say, these hard to electrify emissions, these chemical bonds, so a subset of our industrial chemicals and fuels, we can essentially have a catalytic process in between that allows us to go from our renewable energy technologies into our chemical bonds. You really don't have a whole lot of ways to do this. You're going from one energy form to another, and you're using, say, low energy molecules, say nitrogen, CO2, water, and you're going to be elevating the internal energy of those molecules. So you essentially need a catalytic process in between. And for this, we can go through a heat-based route. So you can always do electricity to heat and then, say, traditional thermocatalysis. You can do an electrocatalysis route, and you can do a combination of the two. So we have solid oxide electrolyzers that are kind of a combination of the two. Now, if we want to look at the actual more specific routes to be able to say, produce a lot of traditional chemicals, we can kind of go into a little more detail. So you essentially have resistive heating plus your base molecules plus traditional thermochemistry. So these traditional thermochemistry, you can think of the Fischer-Tropsch process, traditional methanol synthesis routes, polymerization. So we can use existing technologies, but with renewable energy as inputs. We can go more the water electrolysis route. So you can take your water, you can produce hydrogen, combine that with CO2, and then do, again, a thermochemical process. You can go to my area of research, where you essentially combine hydrogen from water electrolysis and the products from low temperature CO2 electrolysis. You can do direct CO2 electrolysis, which I'll talk about briefly. And then, of course, what was talked about yesterday is more the bioenergy route. And these are kind of the core technologies we have to be able to create chemical bonds that we typically use in our society and are hard pressed to abandon. So the way I like to think of this is more, as I mentioned, kind of an energy perspective, but also a matter of scale. I love back of the envelope calculations. I think that's probably an IESVic staple, if I think back to my education. So what we did in my field of CO2 electrolysis is try and think, okay, let's try and replace a 10,000 ton per day methanol plant. So that's like the largest type of methanol production plants we have in the world today based on fossil fuels. Would it be possible to replace this 10,000 ton per day plant with a renewable plant that's based on initially ambient conditions? So say we have our solar panels, we have CO2 under ambient conditions. This needs to be a little updated, I think. And then let's say we have water under ambient conditions. And the main thing to do this was more a brainstorming session to say, how can we inform the current field of CO2 electrolysis to guide their research? So you can piece together many different processes to do this. We just chose a purely electrical route. So we had, say, alkaline capture of CO2 mixed with regeneration through bipolar membrane electrodialysis. So we calculated the rough efficiency of this process, if you will. You can then pair this with a CO2 electrolyzer to get your carbon monoxide. And then similarly, you combine this with your water electrolyzer to get your hydrogen, and you can do a methanol synthesis process. And there are dozens of these types of processes that exist, and hundreds of plants around the world that are producing more than 1,000 tons per day from fossil fuels. And you can imagine trying to replace these with non-fossil fuel route alternatives. So what we want to do is, okay, this 10,000 ton per day plant is about 5% of current global capacity. And as part of our thought exercise, we wanted to say, well, how big would our equipment need to be? If you can convince people the scale of things, it can be a pretty powerful perspective. So we wanted to say, okay, what's the area of solar panels? What's the capture area of say, CO2 capture plants? And specifically, what is the geometric area of catalysts that we need for our electrolyzers? Thankfully, a lot of these can be done with either online tools. So depending on where you are in the world, you can get your solar profile, your efficiency, depending on the type of solar panel you have. The area of capture unit you need is quite easy. You just have essentially your velocity going through your system, your absorption fraction. And then similarly for your catalyst areas, you can just have the metrics for your devices. So we took this thought exercise and we more or less crunched the numbers. And a 10,000 ton per day fossil plant with kind of expected efficiencies for each devices requires, I think it was around 5 gigawatts of energy. So we're not considering the intermittency at the moment, just a steady state. And then in the Netherlands, where we don't get too much sun, but it's not that different from Victoria, we calculated that you need 243 square kilometers of solar panels for this single methanol plant. And this is about 5 times larger than the Pavagata Solar Park by area. And to put that into more perspective, we have the EnVision campus here, the beautiful campus. My home growing up, I think, was over here. And then we can zoom to Greater Victoria, just to give you an idea of the scale of, say, solar panels we would need for such a system. Similarly, you can calculate the area of CO2 capture area you need. So around 220,000 square kilometers versus the largest Climeworks plant in Zurich. But then what we really cared about for this analysis was how much CO2 electrolyzer area you want. And what we wanted to start to get to was the same types of analysis that can be performed for PEM systems when you're determining if we have, say, enough iridium on our planet to run our oxygen evolution reactions in our PEM systems. And then what we essentially found was for this singular plant that only generates 5% of current global methanol, you would need roughly 4 times larger, 4 to 5 times larger than the Norsk Hydro water electrolysis plant that was operating for quite a few years. So bigger than even the biggest alkaline electrolyzer plant that's in existence today. And what we wanted to do with this research, again, was guide research on CO2 electrolysis to avoid, let's say, ideas that would be circulating for 15, 20 years before they bumped up the TRL levels. So if we kind of zoom in on this process again, we can think of how can we actually integrate, say, intermediate technologies into more traditional processes. So if we have a water electrolysis unit or a CO2 electrolysis unit, how does that fit into the grand scheme of making your final products? And you'll notice that when I showed this pretty colorful picture, I didn't mention the fact that this is an intermittent energy source, and the methanol synthesis here must be run continuous. If you don't run it at a high fixed capacity factor, it won't work very well. So what you essentially have at the beginning of your process is this oscillating energy source, and then downstream you more or less have to have a pretty flat load, otherwise you can't use this thermochemical process. So one of the things we look at is more or less how can you design these types of systems within models that also allow you to do life cycle analyses, environmental analyses, and economic analyses. So we kind of built this plant for a 20 kiloton per year with my master's student a couple of years ago. And the main thing I would like you to pay attention here is here we have, say, our electrolyzer units, so our CO2 and our water electrolyzers. And then what we have to have here in the middle is our intermediate storage tanks. So these nice little gray cylinders here. So if we zoom back at this process and look more of a simplified drawing again, we essentially need to go somehow from intermittent energy to a fixed load. And what that means is that we have to buffer our energy load along the process in order for this to be able to operate continuously. And if we look at our electrolyzers in the middle, if you talk to people operating PEM electrolyzers, they might tell you, no, please do not ramp the power of my device up and down. You will hurt my catalyst lifetime. You might have additional losses, for example. So if you say only look at the singular technology, you might say, okay, I'll handle a little bit of buffering load. But what that means is that you have to buffer your energy upstream in the process for this whole process to work. So let's take electrical storage as your buffering mechanism. You now have, let's say, your green energy above your power load going into your battery. When you're below your power load, you're drawing from your battery, and then you can have a straight through here. So you're essentially buffering this middle range. But then when you go downstream, so in between your electrolyzers and your continuous methanol process, you'll have some kind of storage tanks to, say, buffer the rest of the load. And these are able to do that quite easily. But if you're to think which one of these two things is more expensive, buffering with a battery or buffering with chemical storage tanks, the latter is cheaper. So what we essentially did was look at different power bands, look at different power loads, and see how that affects kind of your initial buffering as well as your post buffering. And then you can essentially make an argument for what kind of storage you might need, what are the maximum storage tanks available in industry, and this actually determines the maximum size of your plant. So these are the types of analysis that we perform with a number of other researchers in the e-refinery at TU Delft. I'm more on the experimental small side, but we work with people in the technology policy and management group who do Aspen models and economic models on a daily basis. So these pair well with our chemical engineering students. So what we actually do from these analysis in terms of my lab is we actually take these results. So we say, okay, this is the kind of power band or operation that we actually need to be able to make it work. So we'll take our PEM electrolyzer type cells, but for CO2 electrolysis, and now operate with variable power loads to see how that influences our performance and our stability over time. And we just got a new project to be able to look into this in more detail, where we're actually bringing in people with control theory to help bridge this larger CO2 to final product system. I also like to talk about the role of academia in the Valley of Death. in an academic environment, we're kind of in this weird transition region where we can come up with solutions, but it can be hard to actually enact on a larger scale. And really, I think of how do we go from the watts that we deal with in lab scale to how do we see the gigawatts and the hundreds of megawatts in say industry, and how we bridge this gap is a big question. Ideally at TU Delft, we would like to try and bridge part of this gap. We kind of have a plan in the next couple of years to have more 1 kilowatt devices on campus, as well as get to a 100 kilowatt device, hopefully in the next 5 years. But then there's still a question of who bridges that next gap. So I'm more of the mindset that academia needs to be sometimes more risk takers, and then we have to have policy and governments and funders to be able to believe in us for this. But overall, I see our role as increasing when it comes to trying to scale up or increase the TRL levels of our devices that we work on. So just a brief summary. I think my timing is okay. CO2 utilization is really a necessary avenue to prevent some of the non-electrifiable sources of emissions. One way of doing this is with a combination of water and CO2 electrolyzers. Water electrolyzers themselves are commercial, but they're not really integrated into large-scale chemical processes, especially as they deal with challenges related to intermittent operation. And really, when we're talking about getting into the hundreds of megatons per year scale, these are challenges that require cooperation with industry. It requires cooperation between different industries that don't typically work together. So say having power purchase agreements with your utilities, ensuring that that more or less your chemicals will say be going somewhere on a scheduled basis. And all this adds uncertainty and risk that kind of hurts the business case of it. But it's something we essentially have to get to in one way or another. I'm really interested with more or less how we buffer energy down the line using our electrolyzers. And I really think this will limit plant sizes. I think gone are the days of thousands of tons per day plants, and we'll need, say, many hundreds of tons per day plants to produce renewable type chemicals and fuels. And really this requires an integration of technologies. So our technologies are not kind of a castle on a hill, but kind of a building in a city. And as much as possible, we need to train the next generation to be able to kind of put a mechanical engineering hat on one day, an economics hat on the next day, and a chemical engineering hat on the next day. And that's a challenge for us to do, but hopefully it's something we can do over time. So thank you for your attention. Here's a list of the funders that fund our different projects in the research, but more importantly, the PhDs and postdocs who've really made a lot of research happen and really helped, especially during COVID times, to keep the mood up. So I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A round, and thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Tom. That was great. I have so many questions about this. We're actually going to do it this way, that we are going to go through all the presentations, and then at the end, we're going to let everyone ask the questions. So make sure you write your questions down, and the speakers will stick around at the end in the after party to answer those questions, and I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion. We're going to now go to McKenzie Fowler. I'm actually really looking forward to this one because I've had the pleasure to work with McKenzie myself. McKenzie Fowler is a senior data scientist at Edison Energy who consults corporate clients on achieving their energy goals. Her work now focuses on long-term modeling and analysis of electricity systems across North America, with past experience in the utility and consulting industries focused on northeastern US. She received her master's in mechanical engineering in 2018 right here at UVic, where I had the pleasure to work with her at IESVic's 2060 project. And before that, she received her bachelor's from the University of Massachusetts at Lowell in 2016, also in mechanical engineering. So without further ado, she is going to talk to us about modeling the energy transition. McKenzie, please take it away.
See if I can share my slides. You can see them okay, hopefully?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay. So, like Kevin said, I'm going to talk a little bit today about modeling the energy transition. And so I'm going to jump around a little bit. I'm going to talk about what I've done since leaving IESVic, because I've had a little bit more of a winding career path so far than I think many recent grads might have. I will talk a bit about energy market modeling, which I got my start in at IESVic in the 2060 project. Some recent projects I've been working on and kind of some future plans for projects, as well as some career advice for early grads, since this is Alumni Day. So, like Kevin mentioned, I have my bachelor's and master's in mechanical engineering. I graduated from UVic in 2018, right from IESVic, so great place to be. While I was in the process of finishing up my master's, I started doing part-time work for a startup consulting and software as a service firm based in Boston. And kind of while I was in the process of writing out my master's thesis, I moved back to Boston, started working full-time for the startup consulting firm. And so it was really interesting. I was working mostly on storage integration studies across North America, really focused in MISO, NISO, and Ontario. After a bit of time there, I defended my master's. I decided to move on from the startup consulting world to work for National Grid, which is a utility based in the Northeast US, as well as the UK. And so really at National Grid, I was sitting in corporate strategy at the utility, but on the analytics and modeling side of things. And so I was able to support essentially a lot of different pieces of the business. I was working to support our regulated utilities, which were mostly my work was to support the electric utility, but there was also a natural gas utility, supporting our renewables business, which originally was named Geronimo, is now National Grid Renewables, as well as kind of some National Grid Ventures work, which was really looking at kind of some support in New York, looking at offshore wind, looking at storage, things like that. And so as of this past Monday, I have been at Edison Energy. So I am back in the consulting world doing strategic and economic consulting after 2 years at National Grid. So I'm going to talk a little bit essentially about market modeling and really what it is. And I'm going to kind of stay at the high level. And so there are a lot of things to think about when you're looking at modeling the electricity system. And kind of the first place to start is the market that you're in. So for the last couple of years, I've really been focused on New York and New England in the Northeast US for National Grid. But now for Edison, I'm going to start to be expanding to all of the other markets across North America. And so you kind of have different types of drivers that you need to think about when you're setting up kind of what the market sphere looks like. So you need to think about things like policy and regulation, which are obviously going to have a lot of impact on what's going on in your market and what you're going to need to model. And obviously also technology and economics, so kind of the underpinning of the techno-economic modeling that we do. And so, you know, on the policy and regulation side, things that you're thinking about are technology targets. So, you know, you might have an ISO that's New York or New England, but you have a lot of individual states within that that all have their own separate targets that you need to think about modeling. And so in New England, where I'm based right now, you have a state like Massachusetts, which is really very aggressive, thinking about 100% renewable energy targets or clean targets, really aggressive distributed solar standards and these types of things. And we're right next to a state like New Hampshire, which is kind of the opposite of Massachusetts, certainly much more on the conservative side when it comes to any kind of policymaking or state incentives. You have things like efficiency targets, obviously, that really ties into your energy efficiency that you're going to be thinking about in your region. Federal incentives, you can think about that like your investment tax credits and production tax credits for large scale wind and solar plants. Carbon pricing is, it exists somewhere. Not here quite yet, but And then kind of on the regulation side, you're thinking about things like, what does that mean for your reserve margin? So how much capacity needs to be sitting on to make sure that you can maintain reliability of the grid? So you need to build beyond just what you think you're going to need to meet demand. Think about things like system reliability, capacity markets versus energy markets versus ancillary service markets. How do these all work together? And then again, things like on the technology and economic side, you have your technology advances. So kind of how are the prices of solar or wind or offshore wind or storage falling over the long term or falling at all? Resource availability, and that really starts to take, like, you can take this into account when you're thinking about like, where are you actually siting these projects, which goes into siting and permitting, but it might be a lot cheaper to build an onshore wind farm in a super rural area than it is to build it close to your load center. But then you need to think about things like transmission and how are you actually going to move that power. So yeah, and then kind of all of this is pinned in by macroeconomics, and consumer preference has a big role to play here, which really goes into that siting and permitting, the NIMBYism, you know, not in my backyard. How can we actually make sure that we're getting these things built? And there's a lot more that kind of goes into market drivers beyond just this, but high level overview. So thinking about all of these different things that kind of affect your markets, how do we turn this into something that we can actually model? And so all of the work that I do now, the work that I started learning how to do at IESVic is really based on energy market modeling. And so I'm using two types of models. I'm using capacity expansion models and production cost models, which here is called the energy and ancillary services. And so in the capacity expansion model, if you're familiar with kind of some of the work that 2060 has done previously, you're thinking about really long-term evolutions of the grid. So how is this going to change over the next 30 or so years? What is the capacity mix going to look like? The cost of supply build, kind of all of these different things that go into, you know, long-term evolutions. And everything that falls out of our capacity expansion, we're going to filter into our production cost, which really we're drilling in on years, single years that we're pulling out of our long-term range. And so if you're familiar with some of the work that Madeline's group is doing, this is kind of the production cost work that I'm talking about here. And so we're getting really more detailed observations from our production cost models. We're thinking about energy and ancillary service prices. We're thinking about plant revenues, emissions, fuel consumption, detailed interchange between areas. You can think about this like New York to New England, or Ontario to New York, Quebec, Quebec Hydro coming down to support the Northeast US. And so we do hundreds and hundreds of model runs to really come down to a final answer here. And so the really important features of the models that we're thinking about, so we have these models are all cost optimizing. So we're looking for least cost economic solutions to operate the entire region based on characteristics, resource costs, et cetera, et cetera. There is full representation of transmission with enforcement of key constraints in the models that I'm building. These get relaxed in the longer term as we are less sure about what transmission is going to look like. But certainly there's full representation in the near-term years anyway to help inform things like congestion, reliability, system capacity requirements based on a 1 in 10 loss of load standard, just to make sure that system reliability is always maintained in every hour that we're modeling. And then really importantly, kind of the thing that most people are looking for out of these models our prices. So hourly, nodal, and hub prices. These are nodal models, so they're really quite detailed. You can drill down to, exact hubs or generator buses or things like this to get LMPs, ancillary service prices, seasonal weighted prices, etc. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of some recent results and kind of some of the market environment that I've really been focusing on, which is the Northeast US for the last couple of years. And so starting with kind of the policy scope, there really is kind of pretty intense support for decarbonization across the Northeast. There is a pretty significant state push for offshore wind, really especially in New York. I think probably, I know that everyone is all over the place, but New York especially has been in the news quite frequently lately. Thinking about things like imports from Hydro-Quebec, really we're thinking is going to be really very important to help decarbonize the Northeast US. It's going to be very difficult to do without Quebec's help, and I think they realize that. We're thinking that DG subsidies for distributed generation really will kind of continue to persist, but they're not going to grow substantially in value. That's going to stay the same about what it is right now. As far as thinking about siting and permitting, there is intense NIMBYism in the Northeast and really across North America. And really, this isn't only opposition to fossil fuel infrastructure, which is there, which is why we're really not thinking that many new natural gas plants are going to be permitted after 2030, if any at all. But there's also pretty significant NIMBYism for anything new in the ground. It's difficult to build offshore wind plants right now. It's really difficult to build new transmission, even like large scale renewables. It's difficult. We are thinking that there is going to be no new nuclear or CCUS power plants permitted, but existing nuclear is going to get license extensions to 80 years of life, which has happened for a couple of nuclear plants across the US, which have already been extended to 80 years, which is an additional 20 beyond what they had. And because of all of this NIMBYism and really a huge push against fossil fuel infrastructure, no new major interregional natural gas pipelines built. On the economics front, natural gas prices have been decreasing kind of for quite a while now. We're thinking that this will probably bottom out in the early 2020s soon, though that's been said a lot, so who knows. We are seeing that onshore renewable costs are going to really continue to decline. And this is going to be very significant for energy storage and offshore wind as well. We're expecting sharp declines through the mid-2030s to really help support all of this, renewables growth that needs to happen. There is somewhat patchwork regulation between all of these system operators, which are the ISOs here, as well as the states. We're thinking that states are going to continue with their centralized procurements to meet their clean energy targets, because like I said before, they all kind of have their own plans about what they're doing, and that capacity markets and reliability must-run contracts are going to really be increasingly important to make sure that any existing plants remain viable. So we're thinking about kind of existing natural gas plants that are going to be used less and less as we continue to decarbonize our electricity system. We are likely going to still need them for capacity reasons and reliability reasons. And so these types of contracts, making sure that they get paid, even if they're not generating, are going to be really important. And then, you know, a really hot topic that I think I started talking about when I was doing my master's thesis is flexibility. Really will continue to be pivotal as we continue to decarbonize. And so you'll see in a bit, but we're expecting a lot of this is going to come from battery storage. And then as far as transmission and distribution go, there have been kind of some big announcements lately from the Biden administration that are starting to think about this big infrastructure bill, are thinking about things like transmission and distribution, which is huge and really important because it's been overlooked for quite a long time. But New York has started thinking about this already, and they've come up with these public policy transmission projects that they're trying to get built. So there are a couple that are in process, and we're thinking that these are kind of going to continue and that other states will start doing the same thing. And again, like I had mentioned before, these interconnections to Quebec are going to be really important. We are assuming that there is not going to be a significant offshore wind network for offshore wind, but remains to be seen if that happens kind of later in the modeling period in, you know, the 2040s and 2050s. So continuing on. Okay, so some quick results from some recent Northeast US studies that I've done. So looking out to 2050, we do see pretty significant transformation, but we don't quite get to a zero emissions goal. So as far as decarbonization goes, we're thinking that we're going to see about a 79% carbon reduction from 1990 levels, which is when most places are measuring from. And a lot of this is due to generation. It doubles to over 80% by 2050 from clean sources, which is renewables, nuclear, and hydro in this case. It reaches about 83%, I think it is. Natural gas-fired installed capacity declines from 45 gigawatts to 30 gigawatts, which if you think about that in New York and New England, it's not a huge place if you're not familiar with it, but 30 gigawatts of natural gas capacity is still, it's a lot of capacity to sit around and not do very much. And that's where those kind of capacity market contracts and the RMR, reliability must run contracts, are going to come in really important. Starting to think about things like electrification of light duty vehicles into electric vehicles, as well as building heating demand being electrified. We're seeing about a 71 terawatt hour increase by 2050. It's pretty negligible at this point in 2030, but we're expecting that to increase quite significantly. We're thinking that about 2/3 of light duty vehicles will be EVs by 2050. And really in this case, we can see that the blue bar, that 37% is heat. The Northeast has a bit of a mesh of different types of heating systems in place. And so there's a lot of oil-fired heating, there's some gas-fired heating, there are some heat pumps assorted. And so we're thinking that a lot of the oil-fired heating is going to switch over and hopefully will be switched to heat pumps to electrify, but that a lot of the gas will kind of stick around as it's still pretty inexpensive comparatively to installing a heat pump. Northeast, for reference, has some of the highest electricity rates across North America. So that's why that's, you know, quite less significant. And then as far as installed renewable capacity goes, by 2050, we're seeing about an 82 gigawatt increase of renewables. A lot of this is made up of solar because it is kind of the least expensive of the resources, but also that 28 gigawatts of offshore wind is really significant, along with that 12 gigawatts of interconnectors. It says hydro interconnector, but it's from Hydro-Quebec. And those are really huge because when you think about kind of the capacity contribution of an interconnector from Quebec supplying clean hydro is, you know, much more significant than solar or offshore wind or onshore wind, but offshore wind too. So by 2050, we're seeing about a 50% wind and solar penetration. Offshore wind is the largest single source of generation at about 25%, which is huge. But all of these renewables are really made possible by this, like, I think it's about 33 gigawatts of grid connected battery storage, which if you think about now is like, it doesn't really exist significantly. We're thinking that that's going to change really quite significantly. And the lithium ion battery storage is really going to make all of this possible. So this is what I've been doing kind of in the utility sector over the last couple of years. But as of Monday, I'm now switching gears a bit. So I'm moving back into the consulting space. And so I've joined Edison Energy, which has 4 different practices built into it. There's a sustainability advisory, renewables advisory, supply, and energy optimization practice. So the sustainability practice is really about understanding risk, reducing cost, developing goals for corporate clients. The renewables is really thinking about signing PPAs and things like this for corporate clients that want to essentially have energy goals established. Now they want to figure out how to meet them. And so this renewables practice is what I'm sitting in, kind of trying to help identify projects, figure out how we're going to meet these goals in the long term, managing risk, coming up with portfolios, these types of things. The supply piece of the company is really thinking about energy procurement plans, managing risks in terms of kind of new opportunities for natural gas and power, and kind of developing new solutions for these businesses. And then the energy optimization practice is really thinking about kind of complex energy efficiency and conservation projects. So distributed energy resources, storage, EV fleets, energy audits of corporate buildings, these types of things. So within the renewables advisory, I am really trying to think about still looking at the long term, but really focused in on providing prices to help these companies figure out, you know, what kind of projects that they want to sign into, how to sign a PPA, which PPA to sign. And so I am on a new team here as well, which I was also on a new team at National Grid, trying to kind of build up some of this in-house modeling capability. And so as of Monday, I've started on building on a model of ERCOT, which has been in the news quite a bit recently. So really looking forward to this. So my last slide, I think I'm doing okay, I hope. I do have some advice for early career grads because I am one myself. And over the last few years, as evidenced earlier by my pathway, I've had a couple of different jobs. And there are some reasons for this, but some of these sound a little bit cliche, but bear with me here. The first one I would say is don't settle. If you are unhappy at your job, it doesn't make sense to stick around. And I think that, you know, finding a mentor, which is another one on here, is really key to figuring this out. And so if you can find somebody at your company that, you know, you really look up to, you'd like to, you know, model your career path after theirs, you know, look to them for advice and see if they'll talk to you. You know, finding a mentor has been really huge for me, and it's actually a huge piece of the reason I've just moved to Edison. I'm actually following an old boss, so I think it's really important to you know, work for somebody that you know, really supports you. Another piece would be make sure you read the news and keep up to date on everything that's happening, even if it's just like the New York Times or something, you know, or industry news, these kinds of things. It's really important and will help you start to piece all of the different things together. Will help you understand the industry a lot better. When you're looking for a new job, diversity is really important. If you look at the leadership board of the company that you're joining, and you don't see diversity, that should be a warning sign, which is something that I have realized. Ask for feedback really often. You know, this kind of is only going to help you improve. I think, you know, err on the side of over communication rather than under communication. So if you can get as much feedback as you can and give as much feedback as you can, it's really going to only help your career. Interviews do go both ways. This is something that I did not realize going into my first job. So, granted, in an interview, they're trying to figure out if you're the right fit for them, but you should really be treating it the same way. And again, trying to make sure that you're going to be working for somebody that might be a mentor for you. It's really important because I can, attest to the fact that work is going to be a lot more enjoyable if you're working for somebody that is really, thinking about your career as well as their own. This next one, create a personal board. I found this on the internet, but it was kind of putting words to something I was trying to articulate, which is really that you should try and network with as many people in your company as you can and kind of try to create a series of mentors. So, you might have one main, but you should try to branch out a bit and meet as many people as you can. The more advice that you can get, the better it's going to be. Find your joy really goes along with don't settle. It's important to try out different things, try out different types of companies, try out different types of jobs, figure out what you really like to do and chase that. Volunteer. I think this can be anything. It can be volunteering your time at the company, whether there's an internship program that you can volunteer and mentoring for interns or something like this, or if it's signing up for, they need somebody to do team safety moments or something like this, just try and put your hand up for as many of those opportunities as you can. Continue learning. It's pretty self-explanatory. It doesn't stop when you graduate. So whether you can go to conferences, whether you can do classes or anything like this is really great. And I think the last one would be make sure that you negotiate. And so this really goes into, it's something that especially early career women fall into, is that when you're offered a job, do make sure that you always ask for more, whether that's salary or benefits or something. They're expecting you to ask for more. So make sure that you do it. All right, I will stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions later. I know I kind of flew through this, so I'm sorry.
McKenzie, that was great. Thanks so much for sharing your experience. In the interest of time, we're going to move right on, and I'm sure I hope you can stick around at the end to answer some questions. So without further ado, I'm actually going to introduce Tyler Bryant, who I've asked here to come today. Even though he's not an IESVic alumni, he is working on a big relevant problem to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I've had the pleasure to work with him over this past year and a half. He's a public policy manager at FortisBC, focused on low carbon strategy, policy, and projects that will allow FortisBC to thrive as an energy utility in the transition to a low carbon economy. Tyler has a multifaceted background and perspectives on energy systems because he's worked for the International Energy Agency, the David Suzuki Foundation, Natural Resources Canada, so all brand names there. And he received his bachelor's and master's from UBC and Simon Fraser University in political science, public policy, economics, and energy economics. So I'm really excited to hear him speak about building out a hydrogen energy system and addressing key technical policy and business research gaps. Tyler, please take it away.
Thanks for these almost fulsome praise, Kevin. So thank you. Glad to be here. Yes, I'm not a IESVic alumni. So thanks for having me anyway. I feel like I'm somewhat a part of the crew though, because have been working with Kevin and Andrew and Peter now for I think close to 2 years, and really have benefited from the perspectives that the folks at that faculty have brought to the questions that we've asked. And so just to give you some background, maybe I do have some slides. I'm trying to be like a non-slide person for 2021, but they are such a crutch that I will. Okay, here we go. I will refer to them. How do I do this here? 1 second. That's not working. Okay. There we go. Slideshow. Okay. Is this beaming through into your
Yes.
living room? Okay, great. So yeah. So well, where was I going with that? Oh yeah. So we are really here in BC at the sharp point of the spear in terms of thinking about the role of our utility, thinking about BC's energy system writ large, in terms of this this movement to a decarbonized energy system. And as everybody on the call probably knows, BC's been, very much a leader in this area and continues to be a leader in this area. And so in many respects, that's kind of daunting for a utility like FortisBC that delivers a lot of fossil fuels currently. But it's also very exciting because we have a very supportive regulatory framework. We have a very supportive policy environment by which to experiment and by which to kind of move forward. And at FortisBC, there is really not an argument about addressing the climate imperative. There's not an argument about decarbonizing. Where the discussion, where the debate is how best to do it. And we've really benefited from the relationship with IESVic, from that energy systems approach that we've actually heard from the two previous speakers, really rolling our sleeves up and peeling the layers back. So what I want to get into that is just kind of where we're kind of going to in doing a lot of different work on decarbonization and kind of what our perspective is on what that future here is in BC. And hopefully to the people online, you can see yourself within this kind of vision for the future, because it will be significant change. It's going to be significant change no matter what we do. As I like to say, we need to decarbonize between, over the next 30 years at more than twice the rate that we've carbonized over the previous 100 years. So we need to adopt low carbon energies at more than twice the rate than how we adopted fossil fuels in our, kind of grand economic explosion over the 20th and 21st centuries. So it's a huge challenge no matter what, but we think that BC is kind of a very interesting petri dish, a very interesting kind of lab experiment in which to kind of move this forward. And I was really interested to hear the perspectives of the two previous speakers. So just before I begin, just a little bit about FortisBC in case you're not familiar. So, FortisBC is the largest utility in BC in energy delivery terms. So we don't have the largest rate base. That would of course be BC Hydro, but in terms of how much energy we deliver to energy consumers, we are the largest. This is something that actually, this is a theme we'll touch on throughout this conversation, is that the scope and scale, the breadth to which the gas system can deliver energy is really, at least in my opinion, not well appreciated by a lot of people. It delivers significant amounts of energy at a very low cost. And so that's why we've built, 50,000 kilometers of pipelines across BC, is because it's a major piece of our energy infrastructure. It's a major piece of providing affordable energy to British Columbians. So FortisBC, we have a rate base of approximately $10 billion. We're investing, $500 million annually. We have quite an aggressive growth target over the next 5 years to increase our capital spending by $4 billion. And a lot of that is going to be through low or no carbon opportunities. So, we deliver about 21% of BC's energy needs. We are also an electric utility. So some version of FortisBC has been around in this province for over 115 years. And that started all the way back with West Kootenay Power. And I actually don't even know what it was called back then. FortisBC, I believe, owns the oldest hydroelectric dam on the continent in our electric service territory. And there's some very cool refurbishments that's happening there. It's called Upper Bonington. It's extremely steampunk. There's like, big electrical stuff. I'm not an engineer, as you can probably imagine, so I'm just going to stop there. There's cool steampunk stuff at that facility, and we're refurbishing it right now. Just to give you a sense of kind of how long we've been operating. And FortisBC Gas was originally a subset of BC Hydro at one point, and that was eventually spun out and privatized, and now went through different structures of ownership, and now it lands with Fortis. And we're in the Fortis family of utilities, which is a holdco that owns about 12 different utilities across Canada, United States, and the Caribbean. So that's a little bit about us. Just to give you a sense. Key point is, we're a big part of this province's energy system. So as a big part of the province's energy system, we need to be a big part of the province's energy solution. We need to be a big part of that low carbon solution, because we do deliver so much energy. We do deliver a fair amount of fossil fuels. We deliver about 200 petajoules a year of fossil fuels in terms of natural gas to end use consumers. So our first kind of stake in the ground on this was developing our 30 by 30 target. And that is our target to reduce our customers' greenhouse gas emissions by 30% by 2030. So that we see here would lead to about a 4 million ton reduction by 2030. So that would be the single largest reduction that would be accomplished by any one entity in the province over the next 10 years. And here's kind of a waterfall chart on how we're going to do it. And so it's broken down into kind of 4 big wedges. There's lots of work to do across the utility along all 4 of these. So zero and low carbon transportation, we've helped deploy through incentives over 1,000 gaseous powered trucks, for example. There is 7 right now actually, marine vessels that are powered with LNG, for example. We have 40 public electric vehicle charging stations in our shared service territory in the electric utility. And so there's lots of work to do. We are looking at multi-fueling stations, hydrogen fueling stations, lots of work to do there. On energy efficiency, of course, this is kind of the bog standard type of DSM programs, but it's not bog standard in terms of the scale to which we're investing. So we're going to invest close to $100 million this year in energy efficiency incentives. That would make us one of the largest private investors in energy efficiency in Canada. So lots of activity there and lots of kind of bleeding edge stuff. So deploying gas-fired heat pumps, doing deep energy retrofit pilots. These are all applications that we are pulling together right now, and this will be kind of leading programs in Canada. Of course, we own 2 LNG facilities. One of those facilities is at Tidewater on Tilbury Island in Delta. That facility has been operating since the early 1970s. It was originally a peaker plant. We've since expanded that about 3 years ago to be able to provide opportunities for stuff like marine bunkering. So the Vancouver Port is the second busiest port in North America. There's a potentially really sizable opportunity to reduce emissions by providing LNG as a fuel for those ships that are calling into Vancouver ports. And then, of course, what I want to kind of focus the rest of the talk on was renewable gases. So FortisBC, as I like to say, we're an energy infrastructure company. We are not a how do I put this? We don't make any money on selling people natural gas. In fact, we sell people natural gas at the exact same price that we buy it at. We make no markup on natural gas. Where we make our earnings is the fees that we apply to using our infrastructure, our pipeline delivery infrastructure, or our electric poles, our poles and wires. And so from that perspective, we just want to make sure that the infrastructure is used. It's 50,000 kilometers across BC. As I like to say, we don't care what flows through that pipeline. We can deliver craft beer to our customers if that's what they in fact want through our pipelines. And so in terms of the fuel type, we're fairly agnostic. In fact, we see a huge role to flipping that fuel source over to renewable fuels, renewable gases. And this is what I want to talk about today, and kind of what I heard some of the other speakers discuss. So let's just get into this renewable gas thing. And this is, in many respects, what Kevin and I have been working on for the past year and a half, is kind of mapping out what role could renewable gases have in BC in decarbonization. It's very much an open question. This is kind of one of the final frontiers on decarbonization, kind of discussion on the pathways to decarbonization, is figuring out gaseous fuels, what role will they have? And it won't surprise you to know that FortisBC thinks that they should and would have quite a large role. So right now, in terms of our renewable gas program, we have 0.4 petajoules of supply. And I should just pause there just to say as a side note, we've operated the longest standing renewable gas program in North America. So we've been operating a renewable gas program for since 2011, so for 10 years. And there's only really 3 or 4 other utilities on the continent that have an operating renewable gas program. What do I mean? What do I mean by that? I mean that our customers can sign up and subscribe for renewable gas to be delivered to them. I use delivered notionally. It's the same way that it works through like something like Bullfrog Power, where you buy renewable electricity. You're providing that incentive to go out and acquire new supply. So we have 0.4 petajoules now. In the next 18 months, 2 years, we're going to have an additional almost 6 petajoules of supply come online. We have another petajoule for approval with our regulator. We're in advanced term sheet negotiations right now for approximately 4 petajoules. And we've issued 2 RFEOIs for projects for renewable gas supply projects over the past 2 years. And we have about 30 different projects that are kind of in the queue that we're evaluating for an additional 13 petajoules. So needless to say, like in the next 5 years, we have a pretty good line of sight to about 25 petajoules of renewable gas. That would get us almost to a 15% target by 2030. So British Columbia, what I was saying, is very much a leader. Well, they have announced that they want to implement a 15% renewable gas target by 2030, excuse me. This is a leading policy around the world. It very much recognizes that the gas system should have some important role to play in decarbonization. And to give you a sense of how big this is, like were we to get to 15%, that'd be about 30 petajoules of gas. That's 60% more energy, clean energy, that would be provided by Site C at 30 petajoules. So it would be a huge introduction of low carbon energy into our provincial energy system, just achieving a 15% renewable gas blend by 2030. And as we see here, we're kind of well on the way to achieving that. I wouldn't say that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, and it's likely that we will surpass that number by 2030. Over the long term, so most of, or all of that gas, excuse me, will likely be supplied by RNG, biomethane from traditional anaerobic digestion, biomethane from gasification, so from gasification of wood waste, and RNG from out of province, so from projects from out of province. That's going to make up the bulk to 2030. But it's really that after 2030, that kind of full flip over to renewable gases that we really want to talk about. We don't really want to stop at 15%. We want to get to 75%, for example, by 2050. And there's obviously significant challenges in doing so, and kind of what is that gas mix? What is that fuel type? And that of course leads us into the into this discussion around hydrogen, because, you know, hydrogen is really not necessarily constrained by feedstock as renewable natural gas as biomethane is. So biomethane, you need a biogenic source of feedstock, typically waste feedstock, and there is kind of somewhat of a hard limit on how much of that you have. Notably in BC, we do have a lot of it. Like, we have a fairly large forestry sector, relatively speaking, in this province. As I like to say, you know, it's about 4 to 5 times larger, relatively speaking, than the forestry sector in California. So we produce a lot of biomass waste here in BC that can be used to produce renewable gases. We also have immense potential to produce hydrogen in this province for a variety of reasons. And so our vision for hydrogen is that this will eventually be kind of the major gas type that ends up utilizing BC's gas system into that 2050 net zero and beyond, into that kind of net negative type of world. And so our vision is, developing a series of hydrogen backbone pipelines. So we see there's T-South, as we call it, the Enbridge line that goes from the gas fields in the Montney for northeastern BC down into the lower mainland, and then further beyond from Sumas into the Pacific Northwest. We are in the process of funding a study that's going to get off the ground right now to evaluate an inch-by-inch approach to the gas infrastructure in this province to make sure it's ready for blends of hydrogen. We are looking at creating hydrogen hubs all over the province. So there's a hydrogen hub there you see in Prince George. There's a hydrogen hub in the lower mainland, hydrogen hubs along, say, a southern crossing pipeline route from Alberta to BC to produce green and blue hydrogen. Our choice there is, we're relatively agnostic in terms of where the hydrogen comes from. This is a major advantage that BC and Canada and Alberta have, Western Canada has, is that we can produce hydrogen pretty cost effectively. So blue hydrogen, that can be produced between $10 and $14 per gigajoule kind of right now here in BC, here in Alberta and BC. Green hydrogen can be produced anywhere from $25 to $55 per gigajoule, but of course that'll significantly decline as the price of renewable power goes down, or variable renewable power. We see creating hydrogen islands on our system. So a good example would be something like the new St. Paul's Hospital in Vancouver. Now, these are just kind of high-level concepts. So not to say this is being implemented, but just to say, like, these are ideas that are being thrown around right now that we find large anchor load tenants for hydrogen that can take very high blends. So say 100% hydrogen boiler or a large fuel cells type system. And we can deliver high degrees of hydrogen to specific nodes on our system. Central heat in downtown Vancouver, for example, could be another example of a long-term play to hydrogen. And then, of course, leveraging all that into a sizable export opportunity. So shipping hydrogen to other economies, to places like East Asia that is very interested in hydrogen, and allowing that export opportunity to, in large parts, pay for the infrastructure updates that would be needed to deliver to our domestic consumers. So our consumers could benefit from the export opportunity by kind of free riding, if you will, on the infrastructure that will need to be built to provide that hydrogen export opportunity. So there's a broad vision here, and it's extremely early days, but it looks as though this is quite a viable. This could be quite a viable strategy when we think about the challenges that we're facing with decarbonization. So what are those challenges? Well, what are the benefits, I guess I should say, of using the gas system is that, the gas system is basically purpose-built to meet seasonal energy demands. So the gas system delivers over half of the energy, like of its annual energy, delivers over half of its energy in any one year in less than 30% of the days in the year. So there's large times of the year where the gas system is very much idle. It's just providing industrial energy consumption, like a gas for industrial energy uses and water heaters and that kind of thing. So the reason it can do that is because it can store energy incredibly cheaply. And so this is a factor we need to be considering when we're thinking about decarbonization. This is the other perspective of the utility, is that, yes, we need to decarbonize, but the table stakes for the utility as well is not, it's like a three-legged stool, as I like to say. We need to get low carbon, but we also need to be affordable, and critically, we also need to be reliable and resilient. And we saw kind of that McKenzie was talking about, what was happening or she alluded to what was happening in Texas and ERCOT. Like, that's kind of what happens if you pursue, in Texas, they pursued affordability above all else, right? Not necessarily low carbon, but affordable, one leg of that stool. They forgot about resiliency and reliability. Like, they didn't value that, So the low carbon energy system needs to be all three of those things. You cannot sacrifice one for the other, because you get in a situation where your system could have fundamental problems, and you could significantly slow yourselves down to your low carbon objectives if you forget about those other two things. And that's why the gas system looks to be attractive, is that it enhances your resiliency, your reliability. You have two infrastructure systems working at once. And it also potentially is a more affordable route. So this is very much the work that Kevin and I have done, is looking at how do we meet these peak energy periods using different types of approaches, using the electric system or using the gas system. And just, the electricity system just stores energy at a much higher cost. And in some respects, that's why we have, these hydroelectric dams. That energy potential of electricity, the value we get from electricity is so much higher, for example, for computing and all these, high value uses of electricity. So that's why we have this system. But in terms of providing that seasonal storage, it's still not there yet. And maybe it'll never get there. Maybe it'll never be competitive with the gas system. So that's why we are promoting this benefit of the gas system, is let the gas system onboard some of that abatement need, take the pressure off the electricity system. Let's use both systems where they're good. Gas system for storing energy, electricity for providing that instantaneous high value energy currencies. So just to give you a sense of kind of, this isn't.
Sorry, Tyler, I'm gonna have to ask you, in the interest of time, to just offer a final thought, just to give John a chance to get in there as well.
Sure. Well, I can say final thought is, we need to partner with people like you. We need to take this vision. So we're miles and miles from this vision to this being on the landscape, so to speak. And so in order to do that, partnerships are going to be needed and required. And I hope that you can see kind of a role for yourself, or a role in kind of adding or contributing to this vision for kind of a low carbon gas system working in conjunction with our electricity system. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Tyler. I really appreciate this, you coming here today. I think we should offer honorary memberships. It's been great working with you on this, and your thoughts on this. I look forward to discussing this in the after party bit. But we're a little bit over time. I hope you've brought a little bit of extra time, because I'm really looking forward to hearing our next presenter. John Dikeos is a senior manager at ICF, and he's worked as an energy management consultant for over 13 years. So who better to speak to us about energy consulting than him? He supports a variety of utility and government clients with understanding and prioritizing their sustainability goals. His work has focused on assessments of energy efficiency technologies, demand-side management, potential studies, the design and implementation of innovative programs, and the development and delivery of relevant training courses. So he is going to give us an introduction to the world of energy consulting. Take it away, John.
Great, thanks for the introduction, Kevin. I was just double muted there, so just navigating some of the technology here, and I'm going to share my screen to make sure that everybody can see my presentation. So is that coming through for everybody?
Yes, go ahead.
Screen with my, sorry, I'm just going to bring the controls to my other screen here. The challenges of multi-screen setup. All right. So like I said, thanks again for the introduction, Kevin. I'm going to turn on this cool little video here. This animation works because I think it's pretty neat as the title slide of the slide deck. So I'm happy to be here today. As Kevin mentioned, my presentation is going to be focused on providing an introduction to the world of energy consulting. I'm sure that everybody has varying levels of familiarity with energy consulting or consulting in general, probably largely dependent on the exposure that you've had. For instance, you may have friends or family that work in consulting. I know McKenzie mentioned in her presentation earlier some of her experience in consulting as well. So I'm sure there are several alumni that have moved on to the consulting world. And I guess everybody goes through the process of scoping out career paths. For some, that process happened a long time ago. For others, they may just be getting started at it, or be at the early stages. From my perspective, consulting wasn't a profession that I really knew much about before I got involved in it. Just by chance, it kind of worked out that way, that I wasn't really exposed to it prior. So I thought it would be useful to provide a high-level overview of the world of energy consulting and highlight some of the interesting projects that I've worked at during my time. Oh, the video is playing again. That's not what I wanted. All right, so I wanted to start with a little bit about me. So first off, I really enjoyed my time at EnVic, and I'm being plugged into the IESVic community. I'm obviously an IESVic alumni. I graduated back in 2006. It's somehow been 15 years, and that time has really flown by. I did some graduate research for Dr. Rowe that was focused on magnetic refrigeration, both modeling and experimental validation. That was really cool. Got to work with some really neat equipment. Really enjoyed my time while I was at EnVic. I had a short stint at Natural Resources Canada before moving to energy consulting in 2008. I've now been an energy management consultant for a little over 13 years. I am a senior manager, as was mentioned earlier, at a company called ICF, which some of you may have heard of. I'll give you at least a high-level overview of the company later on in my presentation. I'm part of the flexible load management team, which has staff across the US and Canada and works with clients across North America. We support a variety of utility and government clients, as was mentioned, with understanding and prioritizing the sustainability goals. So there's quite a diversity of the work that we do, and I'm going to touch on some of the interesting projects that I've been involved in later in my presentation as well. So as was mentioned, the work that I focused on has primarily been assessments of energy efficiency technologies. So in different areas of the adoption curve, trying to help utilities and government understand what they should focus on and prioritize as part of their research and program implementation. Also looking at different types of demand side management potential studies. Those have kind of evolved now, and our clients are more so interested in looking at things that like electrification and non-pipe solutions, which I'll talk about a little bit. So that's the kind of the utility evolution piece. I've also been involved in designing and implementing innovative programs, which can be very interesting when it's kind of cutting edge and bleeding edge in some cases. And also increasingly in the development and delivery of relevant training courses as well. And I'll talk about one example of some relevant work that's actually in BC that I'm working on in training at the moment. So that's me, touching briefly on what energy consulting is all about. So some of you may already know a lot about it by being exposed to it. So for the most part, you're hired guns, I would say. You know, we are hired by government, utilities, and private companies to complete work on their behalf. When companies don't have the internal expertise, they hire companies like ICF to do work on their behalf. In a lot of cases, the companies may be too small, or they may be doing work only for a short time in that area, so they don't have the targeted expertise, and it may not make sense for them to hire staff to fully you know, staff a department that does work in that area when they don't do they're not planning on doing work in that field on an ongoing basis. So that's when teams like mine are brought in to support our clients. Within the world of energy consulting and consulting in general, there's generally two tracks that staff can go on. So there is both the project management track, and there's a technical track. So project management track, you still get involved in the technical components of the project, especially during the early portions of your career. But then, you know, if you have the penchant for it and it's something that you like and are good at, you have the opportunity to direct resources, to have more of the client interaction, to kind of plan the work. And some project managers like to pull themselves out of the technical components and focus more on the project management. Project managers like myself like to stay plugged into the technical components, because I think otherwise I would get really bored if I wasn't doing some technical work. And then there's the technical track. So if you don't like those other components that I discussed previously with regards to project management, resource management, you can really stay focused, become a technical expert. They're equally valued in our company, and there's parallel tracks for them. And so it's kind of interesting that there's those opportunities to grow in different ways. Thinking about some of the pros and cons of energy consulting, one of the main benefits of consulting is that there's an excellent variety in the work that we do and the clients that we work with. And that's something that you don't see in a lot of other environments where I guess there's pros and cons to that as well, obviously. I mean, the diversity is really good. If you're focusing on one topic, something that you really like, and you want to do that for your career, that's great. I really enjoy the variety in the work that we do, and the fact that we get to work on so many different types of projects for so many different types of clients. There's also good opportunities for career advancement to grow in different ways. As I mentioned, there's those two tracks. And you can grow and manage teams, manage projects, or become that targeted expert. Schedules are also pretty flexible, in some ways similar to academia in terms of the flexibility there. I know it's obviously important that you work somewhat standard hours, but there's quite a bit of flexibility as long as you're working the hour requirement for the week, and you're available for important meetings and things like that. That's really mostly what matters. Also, I would say that there's never a dull moment, because there's so much going on, especially as you advance in your career and you take on more responsibility and get involved in more projects, managing more projects and whatnot. In terms of some downsides, it is a relatively high pressure environment at times with demanding schedules on your time. So it's not necessarily a good fit for everybody. It's definitely a faster pace, I would say, than some government positions, or maybe many positions in academia, which may or may not suit your personality. And the other downside, which I guess is similar to a lot of other areas of work, but you don't see this across the board, is that we're always bidding on new work. We're always trying to see what's next. We're always bidding on requests for quotes or requests for proposals. So that BD is a pretty heavy component of what we do, and we never really know what's going to come in. So it sometimes comes in at inopportune times and kind of adds to the workload. You may have a really busy week already, but then you have a proposal on top of that you need to work on as well. So I am going to be focusing on my experience with ICF. I was actually with a small company called Marbeck in the early part of my career that was acquired by ICF in late 2010. So it's a distant memory now. So I kind of just say that I've been with ICF for 13 years because that's been the majority of my time with them. But I want to note as well that we have numerous competitors who also do a lot of great work, and we're obviously competing on contracts all the time. All right, so a little bit about ICF. I don't want to dwell on this for too long because there's a lot of information that I can go into, but just want a very high level overview. So ICF has been around since 1969. We have a global presence with 70 offices across the globe. We're headquartered in Washington, D.C. area in Fairfax, Virginia, actually. But we also have 4 offices in Canada, over 7,000 employees, and 2020 revenue over 1.5 billion. So pretty large company, obviously. We're publicly traded on the NASDAQ. And I would say we're one of the most diverse consulting firms, or more diverse than a lot of consulting firms that kind of focus on particular areas. So you'll see on the bottom there that we have world-class expertise in these 4 pillars of energy, environment, health, and transportation. So my work is obviously focused more on the energy side, where we have about 1,500 staff that do a variety of different types of work. But there's equally interesting projects and support that we provide in those other areas as well. And in terms of the different types of work that we do, these are the main categories of advisory, program implementation, analytics, digital, and engagement. My exposure with projects that I've been involved in has primarily been in the first 3 categories of advisory, program implementation, analytics. A little bit less on the program implementation side as my career has advanced. That work is interesting, but tends to be a bit more commoditized. So not necessarily as cutting edge. So as I've advanced, I've become more and more involved in advisory and analytics type of work. There's some descriptions here of the different types of studies that we work. These are kind of not very specific descriptions to energy. So it kind of cuts across the different areas that I mentioned. So within the energy group, we do work in a bunch of different sectors and are quite multidisciplinary. There are a lot of engineers within ICF, but we have a lot of other different types of staff as well, economists and chemists and all kinds of different backgrounds, policy and whatnot. I think it really helps that we have a lot of staff that have on the ground experience with different technologies as well, and analyzing the energy consumption in specific buildings, and implementation experience with implementing equipment in particular buildings as well. That kind of feeds into our analytics. It's always important to have that kind of on the ground experience. And just a quick graph here that I thought would be useful to kind of show our Canadian utility clients. So basically, the majority of the utilities across Canada we've worked with in some capacity. We're implementing we do turnkey implementation of energy efficiency programs on behalf of utilities. We do a lot more of that in the US than in Canada, but we have some pretty large contracts in Canada as well in terms of program implementation, some of which I've been involved in the past. So next I wanted to move on to examples of some of the work that I've been involved in, and these are relatively recent examples. It's kind of crazy if the diversity in the work that I do, and most of the projects that I'm going to go through today are all projects that I've been involved in the last year or so. Plus, there's a long list of additional projects. So just to kind of highlight some of the diversity there, it's really interesting. one of the hot topics and something that's been mentioned in a few other presentations is electrification. We're in the process of completing electrification potential study for Natural Resources Canada at the moment. This is a first of its kind study in Canada. So we were really excited to win this work, and we kind of recently met the main deliverable deadline for NRCan. So the main components of the project took about 7 or 8 months to complete. So the project was basically focused on assessing the potential for electrification across Canada. We looked at a modeling horizon of 50 years, so a pretty significant length of time and hard to forecast where things are going to go in that timeline, but we definitely took a stab at that. We looked at energy consumption pretty much across the board, so in all different types of buildings, different types of transportation, and industrial processes as well. We segmented things down by quite a number of regions. So looking at the provinces, territories, and off-grid, which was also pooled into one. IPOG there stands for in-province off-grid. We also looked at all of the fuels basically that could be electrified. There's a long list of those, total of 11 fuels that were considered as part of our analysis. So the key deliverables of that particular study were cataloging carbon emitting end uses. That title I find is a little bit misleading. What that was all about was basically providing a detailed breakdown of how non-electric energy is used based on a variety of sources. So basically slicing and dicing and looking at how energy is used, and kind of allocating a piece of the energy consumption to each little slice that you looked at. And that was both looking at our base year for energy for the analysis, and also forecasting out to 2070. So next we produced a detailed catalog of electro technologies. So this was a characterization basically of a pretty significant number of electrification measures. So looking at, looking at the energy impacts, looking at the costs that are associated with that, the relative lifetimes of the baseline technology and the upgrade technology as well. There's a lot of detail in that catalog that we provided for NRCan. They're actually planning on making that catalog public, which was really interesting as well, because that we hope will help spur innovation and kind of help fast track things so that utilities can move faster in terms of implementation of electrification projects. And then beyond that, another important piece of the project was an assessment of electrification potential, where we looked at a variety of potential scenarios. So for those that have been exposed to these types of studies in the past, you typically start with your technical potential, where you look at, something technically possible. Then you add your economic screen, which is, and you call that your economic potential. And then you add some additional layers of reality and kind of look at what will prevent, what factors are going to prevent technologies from being adopted in reality. And that's called the achievable potential. And that also considers who, no matter what incentive or no matter how hard you try to convince them, won't adopt a particular technology. So this was a very interesting study. The graphics that are included here are quite small, obviously, but just to kind of highlight some of the outputs. Some of the outputs, as I mentioned, will be available publicly. The challenge here is that each of the projects that I'm highlighting could be its own 20-minute presentation. Happy to address any questions and kind of point people to resources if they're interested. Maybe I'll just leave that to the end of the presentation. We're also hoping to become involved in follow-up work for NRCan and utilities across Canada and help them understand the impacts of electrification. And I know we've already done some related work for the Canadian Gas Association, for example. As Tyler was mentioning, the gas network is definitely underappreciated in terms of its storage capacity and the role that it has to play, I think, as electrification continues. And I know that's been discussed a little bit in some of the previous sessions as part of this conference. So moving on to the next project example, I have a total of 4 here. The next one is some work with regards to non-pipe solutions that we did at Enbridge. So this work goes back a couple of years. It's been continuing more recently as well, and some subsequent steps. But this was also quite innovative. Enbridge and some other gas utilities as well. This was focused, by the way, on Enbridge Gas, the gas utility in Ontario. And Enbridge is quite large, obviously. They have lots of arms and legs, and lots of kind of brother and sister utilities in other areas, but we were focused on Ontario. They've been getting pushed, you know, as there's this evolution in the energy systems, as there's pushes and targets, more and more aggressive targets to decarbonize and to decarbonize the energy system overall. They've been getting pushed to consider other options when they look at replacing or upgrading their pipeline networks. And that's where non-pipe solutions come into play. Because what they typically do is they basically amortize pipeline investments over 50 years or something like that. So we're starting to get to the point now where we're wondering, you know, what is the energy system overall going to look like in 50 years? And does it make sense to keep on investing as we have been in the past in the gas pipeline network? What is the, you know, how do we do that balancing act? And perhaps we should start looking at other options. So the goal of our analysis here has been to assess demand side management, so energy efficiency measures, look at their peak demand impacts, and look at whether DSM overall can be used to avoid or delay future gas infrastructure investments. So what this study entailed basically was estimating peak demand impacts of a pretty long list of DSM measures, of 150 in total. So we kind of bin those measures into different types of categories. We developed hourly end use load profiles to basically look at peak demand impacts. So how much are you reducing gas consumption on an hourly basis, depending on different types of technologies that you're implementing. And I've highlighted 2 technologies that we had a special focus on because they required a bit more sophisticated analysis to understand, analysis and modeling. And those 2 are adaptive thermostats and tankless water heaters for this particular study. Adaptive thermostats are really interesting because they provide significant annual energy savings, and we're all well aware of that. The adoption and the popularity of these smart thermostats has been pretty high. But we wanted to understand what do they do to peak gas consumption. So basically understanding hourly consumption, you know, on the coldest day when when everybody's waking up and having their showers and having their breakfasts and whatnot, and you're cranking up the thermostat, or in this case, your smart or adaptive thermostat is basically recovering from a setback. So basically, you know, turning the thermostat down automatically overnight, and it's kicking in and kind of recovering from that setback. What impact does that have on peak? And we did some detailed analysis here to understand that a little bit better. And what we found is that although it provides annual savings, it actually ends up increasing your peak demand. Similarly, with tankless water heaters, the fact that they draw a lot of natural gas instantaneously, you have the savings of not having your storage water heater, but what do they do to peak? We did some similar analysis there and found that they, in addition to providing significant annual savings, our energy modeling also suggested that they do actually reduce peak demand, which I can go into detail on and happy to discuss further, but in the interest of time, I probably shouldn't go into that one in any more detail. So we also, as part of this study, developed supply curves to compare the costs of what we call geo-targeted DSM. So looking basically at DSM or programs that you can implement that are close to this pipeline where you're trying to avoid additional growth in your gas and your peak demand requirements for gas. So the amount of gas that you need on a cold day. and looking at comparing that to the cost of infrastructure projects. We consulted with other utilities to assess their progress and kind of understand things where different utilities were at across North America. And more recently, we supported Enbridge with some related regulatory work. So they were basically trying to get approval from the Ontario Energy Board for a particular approach that they were suggesting to move forward on this.
Sorry, John, I'm going to ask you to offer some final thoughts as well, just in the interest so that we can get some questions going.
For sure. I think I'll just describe the last two projects at a very high level, if that's okay. And then that was basically the bulk of my presentation. Okay, the next example that I have here is best practice training courses for the Home Performance Stakeholder Council, which is based in BC. We were basically trying to address the issue with poor quality installations and the fact that they can cause issues with regards to energy performance, comfort, and health and safety. So we developed and deployed BC-specific online training courses that were focused on furnace and air source heat pump retrofit best practices, and also insulation retrofit best practices. So there's some screenshots of the courses here, and these are pretty significant courses. Both of these courses that we developed will take contractors about 40 hours to complete, or each of them will take about contractors about 40 hours to complete. So a significant lift and very interesting projects. And these will actually become a requirement for contractors to complete in BC over the next year or so, in order for them to be eligible to participate in incentive programs. So making sure that as we ramp up energy efficiency and addressing climate targets, that we're doing this in a responsible way, and that the technology is being actually applied properly. The last example, and this is basically my last slide, is innovative energy efficiency technology studies that we've done for FortisBC. This is work that goes back to about 2012, where we've done detailed studies on one technology at a time. So each of these reports is 60+ pages of very detailed work in terms of characterizing the technology and market, assessing energy savings potential and barriers, developing technical resource manuals that utilities can use to for their prescriptive input assumptions for their energy efficiency programs, and providing recommendations on next steps as well. And these studies are basically used by FortisBC to decide on next steps on these technologies, whether they should invest in pilot studies, integrate them into their demand side management, energy efficiency programs. And you can see there's a long list of technologies that some very interesting studies that we've worked on here as well. So I think I'll wrap things up there. And thanks for the opportunity to speak today, and hoping to answer some questions.
Thank you so much, John. That was really interesting. I have great respect for consultants who can come into a new situation, learn about it, and then advise upon it. That's fantastic. So thanks for that insight. With that, I want to wrap up the official session. We did go a little bit over time, but I think this was really interesting. I enjoyed the presentation. So we do have a couple of questions. First of all, I do want to thank the speakers, and if you do need to leave, I understand that. But we do have a couple of questions in the chat. So why don't we just start with those, and feel free to ask more questions in the chat. I think we'll start off with the first one that I think that came to Tom. Rad, why don't you go ahead and read those questions out loud?
Sure. Yeah, actually, I think the first question was from, I have a question for Tom, and then the question is, have you thought about substituting solar with wind, and more specifically offshore wind in your studies? And because it seems that you need a very large area for your solar, so why don't you go to that direction, especially for somewhere like Netherlands?
Yeah, certainly wind would be the choice. For this study, we were more doing a thought experiment. So my colleagues at our kind of more policy and system analysis department generally consider the network across Europe as well as offshore wind as the primary thing. We mainly chose solar just because at the time we could do a quick approximation of the area. There was no particular reason why we didn't use wind in this case.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And next question is for McKenzie. And I have two questions for you. The first one is, how do these models take into account things like community acceptance, buy-in and compliance with local regulators, building local regulators and building code areas, building codes, and etc.
Yeah, I mean, on their own, they don't. They take it into account as about as well as you build it into your assumptions. So things like community acceptance, this is why it's difficult to find people to do this work, because kind of having some knowledge of the area that you're modeling, and what the community acceptance for a new wind project or an offshore wind project or something like that is going to be, it is difficult without that knowledge. So we do try and build it in terms of our capacity expansion and kind of what we're allowing to be built, when, how much it's going to cost, these types of things. As far as local regulations and building codes, again, to an extent, it's your assumptions. I think as far as building codes, this would really be around kind of energy efficiency assumptions, EV charging, that kind of thing. So, in the past, we have contracted some outside models that look at things like EV build out and charging profiles and how it's going to change over time. And we kind of pull this into our load assumptions. Things like energy efficiency, for the most part, we take the outlook from the ISOs, which they do load forecasting usually themselves. And we kind of try and adjust it for different scenarios, but for the most part, we leave the load forecasting up to other people. We're not load forecasting experts, so.
Interesting. There's another question for you, and that is, any suggested reading sources for technical and insightful analysis of the energy sector?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of options out there for really great stuff to read. I think you can go to kind of some of the big universities that have a presence in the energy modeling space to think about those kinds of things. If you go to like Columbia, the Center on Global Energy Policy, they have a lot of really intelligent people working there, and they put out some great stuff. Princeton, Carnegie Mellon, these types of places are great to go to if you kind of want the academic outlook. But then beyond that, NREL does some interesting stuff. I think the place that I go to for most of my news and kind of learning new stuff is actually Twitter. I go to Energy Twitter, and I think that's like the best place to get kind of all of the day-to-day updates about what people are doing.
Interesting. Next question is for John. Thanks a lot, McKenzie. So how often do consultants develop software?
Depends what you define as software, I would say. In general, the answer is very often. In terms of developing custom tools, we do that pretty much for every project, I would say. The levels of sophistication would depend on the project, the size of the project, and what its demands are. I would say we've been moving more and more to developing more so what you would classify as actual software, where we actually have coders that develop pretty sophisticated software and tools that we can then tailor to different customers. So that electrification potential study that I mentioned earlier is one example of a pretty sophisticated tool that we've built, and we are basically relying on the fact that, or we're expecting that a lot of clients will want some similar analysis. So it really makes sense for us to invest in a tool like that. And then on the back end, something that we've also started doing more and more recently is more sophisticated tools to kind of visualize the results. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with tools like Power BI, for example, where we can allow our clients to actually go in and instead of choosing, in the past, we would, produce 100, 200 page report where we would choose what exhibits they may want to look at. We're moving more and more to providing a tool and saying, here are the results, slice and dice them as you would like, and kind of, you can decide what you want to look at.
In continuation of the first question, there's another question, but actually maybe I should have asked them together. The question is, have you seen a shift towards computational competency in the energy consulting field?
Yeah, yes. I would say our tools are becoming more and more sophisticated. So the number of permutations, kind of the amount of data that we're crunching, especially for some of these larger studies, like that electrification potential study that I mentioned, is pretty crazy. I know that that particular tool uses an Excel front end for all of the inputs, because that's pretty easy. Most people know how to structure data as an input in Excel. And then we have an R backend that actually computes using like supercomputers on the cloud. So the amount of computational power that you need to crunch through a model like that, if we were trying to do a similar analysis 10 years ago, and we tried, but it was much harder and more cumbersome to do something like that.
There is another question for you, John. And that is, could you please provide more resources, case studies that help understand work done by ICF?
Yeah, sure. One of the challenges is that a lot of our work isn't public, but it's I can definitely pull together a few reports at least that are public as examples of what we do. I'd be happy to pull that together and maybe send it along to Kevin or Jake or others.
Yeah, great, thanks. Thanks for that.
We can disseminate that.
I think these are the questions which were in the chat room. So now we have another question, and it is more to, I think, all the panelists. The question is anyone working on ground source heat pump? That's one I did hear from anyone. That's one I did hear from anyone today, but I keep hearing about it as great renewable distributed energy option, but only see a few DE systems around that use GSHP. So I'm not sure if I grasped the question correctly, but
we've been doing some related work more recently. There's a study that we're just starting for CIADI, which is kind of an aggregator for utilities. They come up with the ideas and then they try to find utilities that are interested in those studies to actually fund them. So we're just getting off the ground on a study that is looking at developing case studies related to both ground source heat pumps and air source heat pumps. We've had more work, I would say, on the air source heat pump side. There's a huge amount of interest there, and the performance of air source heat pumps has been improving in leaps and bounds, with cold climate variants becoming much more cost effective, for example, and a lot more focus on air source heat pumps as an electrification solution as we look to decarbonize.
Another question for you. Actually, no, it's a question for Tom. I'm wrong. Sorry. The question is, can you give us more about the CO2 system you presented in terms of energy efficiency and economic?
Yeah, I can shed some light on more of the energy efficiency side. The economic side is a very complicated one. There's a lot of if this energy source, if this CO2 emission source. So that's kind of more ongoing. So I can't really give a clear answer on that one. But in terms of energy efficiency, the entire, let's say, ambient CO2 and ambient water with renewable electricity, you could more or less have a thermochemical energy efficiency of around 50%. So going from your raw molecules, doing your CO2 capture and recovery, doing your water electrolysis, CO2 electrolysis, you get around a 50% conversion for your energy. You probably have another base for your ancillary services. And then if you pair it up with, say, a larger site, you also might be able to get some recovery from the heat you generate in the system, but roughly 50%.
Thanks, Tom. I think by this question, we are done with the question in the chat room. So, Kevin,
right. Thanks, Rad. Thanks for taking care of those questions. Oh, I see. We've got
another one.
We have another question pop up. What I would suggest is, because it's 1 o'clock, we are officially at the end. What I would say we do now is I'm just going to stick around here for a while, and whoever wants to stick around is welcome to stick around and have a conversation. I think feel free to turn on your cameras and your mics now, and maybe we can just have a conversation. Feel free to go into any breakout rooms. I'm not sure if we have breakout rooms set up. We can set them up if you want to talk amongst yourselves. Thank you, John and McKenzie and Tom and Tyler, for speaking with us today and for sticking around for the questions. I'm just going to read this one last question. This is actually for Tyler, by Graham. Can you explain a bit more about the economics of renewable gas? How much more expensive is it for you to source renewable gas compared to conventional natural gas? And how does your current supply compare to the demand given these economics? And then I think we'll just open up the floor.
Yeah, so the economics are changing quickly, but general type of approaches. So natural gas is about $3 per gigajoule right now. Renewable natural gas is between $20 and $25 per gigajoule, so a significant step up. But as I like to say, a couple things. Nothing is competitive to $2 or $3 natural gas. So we should not be comparing RNG to basically what is almost essentially free, high quality energy in terms of natural gas. Especially if you account for its real price has dropped by significant amounts, even accounting for low levels of inflation. But in terms of what we should be comparing it to is to the next lowest carbon energy carrier, which would be something like, say renewable electricity or something like that. So at the BC Hydro rate 2, which is, I believe it's 12 cents per kilowatt hour, RNG is actually cheaper than that. So that would be about 12 cents per kilowatt hour. I think it's about $31, $32, something like that per gigajoule. So that's what we need to be thinking about in terms of doing our costing is if we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, what is the next most competitive clean energy carrier?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks, Tyler. It's really interesting because natural gas being so cheap, it's hard to compete with. But if you internalize the externalities of climate change, well, then it doesn't become cheap. So that's one of the problems that we're trying to solve here. I actually have a question for Tom. Since there are no more questions in the chat, I'm just going to ask you that question. So I actually found it really interesting that you said you did this back of the envelope calculation. Love the approach because it can be really insightful. So you said 10,000 tons of methanol per year covers about 5% of the global demand, if I understand that correctly. And that's currently produced from fossil fuels. Is the carbon in that methanol usually emitted in the atmosphere? Are these chemicals usually combusted? Is methanol used for that purpose?
Yeah, I guess it's a 10,000 ton per day plant, not even per year, but per day. So a very, very, very large plant. I don't have a good idea of all the methanol end uses, I guess. It's kind of a versatile chemical that's just transformed into a variety of other ones, but I actually don't know the major end use of it. But at present, it's kind of an intermediary as compared to end use as well. So I actually don't know off the top of my head, but someone here must. The end use of methanol.
I've had the opportunity to actually use methanol myself in a fuel cell. We used it as an off-grid power source in a LiDAR wind measurement device, where the LiDAR had to run for about three months in a farmer's field somewhere. And we used a methanol fuel cell to power it because it's a fuel that you can get. It's clean. It produces very little noise. And you can actually get fuel cells that are in the 100-watt range rather than a diesel generator, which you can only get at bigger sizes, but you don't need that extra power. But the reason why I'm asking is because the chemical bonds, the energy demand for producing chemical bonds from non-fossil fuel sources is not something that I've personally seen in energy modeling. So as we build these energy models going forward, like McKenzie showed, do we need to take this demand from creating chemicals into account that typically I don't think we do at the moment?
Yeah, if we're essentially doing an accounting of say how many chemicals of these we use per year and how many of them are say unavoidable, then I think you could determine it. The problem is they're almost all say made by large industry. So it's essentially industry will do it for a business case rather than it's say fitting into a societal perspective. And they'll essentially want to guarantee that their plant runs at a certain capacity to make a certain amount of money. So it's hard to say if we take into account because it's not society choosing to do it, but rather we're the end users. If that answers your question.
It does. I'm just wondering, so if these emissions do go into the atmosphere, well, then it would make sense for policy to create disincentive for that. So to essentially put a carbon tax on these chemicals, which would then mean that the suppliers, because they're acting in economic interest, would switch to renewable fuels. That means going forward in our energy system, do we have to take into account that large parts of the chemical industry would switch to renewable electricity in order to produce their chemicals?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you're essentially going to be drawing upon any renewable energy you have, and it's kind of funny. We always hear, okay, renewable electricity will keep going down and down and down and down in price, but as long as there's still a value for it, then you'll also find always increased uses for it, and then by definition, it just won't go down infinitely. It'll never be, say, negative to produce it. And that's what a lot of these kind of larger companies that we've talked to here are kind of indicating. They're like, well, once we reach a certain threshold, or once we're forced to do it, all of a sudden overnight they'll say want to all of a sudden take up very, very large energy demands. So in Europe especially, there's a lot of policy discussions amongst the EU as well as with the major emitters, essentially how kind of things come to a joint decision on how to deal with this. But the problem is you don't just have one company owning a refinery or a plant anymore. You have one company that doesn't own the electricity source it needs to produce its renewable plant, and then might not own the downstream processing the same way. So rather than having 2 or 3 companies that agree to do something, you now have to have several companies and several governments to agree on, say, a next generation chemical plant as compared to an existing chemical plant. And then as soon as you increase the complexity, you decrease the chance of something happening.
Yeah, that makes sense. The reason why I thought of this question is because you showed it takes 250 square kilometers of solar panels at our latitudes here in order to produce that amount of power to create those chemicals for 5% of the global methanol demand. And that's just one chemical out of many that you could potentially produce from renewable fuels. And with McKenzie modeling some of the barriers to building infrastructure, McKenzie, you said that you see that there are social license barriers to building certain types of infrastructure. Now, we see we need a big ramp up of renewables. At the same time, we've got these additional demands coming into effect. McKenzie, you've done some modeling that shows we're going to reduce emissions, or the US is going to reduce emissions by 80% by 2050, which we know is not enough to meet our climate targets. Maybe you could say something about how do you anticipate going forward? How do we mitigate the scale up problem, additional demands coming online, but barriers for social license for building this infrastructure?
Yeah, I think that's like the most difficult thing to solve right now. It's the most difficult question that we have when we're doing these kinds of studies. I think that there really needs to be leadership from the states and the provinces across North America in, building relationships with these communities. And the developers need to be doing this as well, really trying to make sure that we can kind of get this infrastructure built, whether it's the utilities working with, building transmission lines, or it's the developers looking at projects. I think there really needs to be a lot more of a social justice, focus from all of these people. And I think that, the federal government is starting to move this way in the US anyway. But I mean, if you look historically, there's been a lot of push and pull between every new, administration that comes and goes. So I think it really is up to the states to make sure that this is done, states and utilities.
Interesting. So it sounds like we need to switch from a top-down planning approach to a more involved. I'm not going to say grassroots because it's hard to plan or national infrastructure. At a very local level, there needs to be coordination. But it sounds like we need to get people that are affected in this involved in the transition in order to make this infrastructure happen. Is that right?
I think that's right. Yeah, Kevin. I think, more involvement from kind of these grassroots organizations, that have been ignored for a really long time. I think that kind of, states and developers, really need to bring them into the conversation and take them a lot more seriously, because I think they're the ones that are really in control of unlocking a lot of this kind of development opportunity.
I would say that states and have largely been filling the void, especially in the U.S. With the federal government definitely previously, trying to do everything they could to push states away from energy efficiency and defund the Department of Energy and all sorts of other things that were really awful under the Trump administration. So the states are pushing pretty hard. I agree with McKenzie that there needs to be action from both ends. I guess we're hopefully in a nicer policy environment now, where there's going to be more positive policy with regards to climate action coming from the federal level in the U.S. And kind of meeting in the middle with states and other organizations.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. It's interesting to hear your perspectives on this and to see the big challenge that we're trying to solve here. For everybody else that's still with us, feel free to join in into this conversation. I don't want to hog the mic here. The reason why I asked this question, maybe I'll just touch upon this anecdotally, is because before I came to Canada, I worked as a wind farm developer in Germany, and the company that I worked with adopted a policy of trying to get the entire town involved in the prospect of building a wind farm. So in Germany, where we were building these farms, those wind farms are typically 5 to 10 or even smaller turbines. So they're significantly smaller than here in North America. And what we had was a situation where there were 5 turbines in a field, and then there were 5 villages around. And the way that our company approached this was that we made sure that we would lease the entire land area where the wind farm was, rather than just the individual land parcels that the turbines were sitting on. And that allowed us to get more people on board. So more farmers would benefit, even if they didn't have a turbine directly on their field, they would benefit. And then another thing that we did there was part of the profits would actually be go to the town councils of those 5 villages in order to fund community projects. And that did make our projects a little bit more expensive, but there was a setup where the company was charging extra for this power to make sure that these community projects would be funded. And we actually saw a lot of support from our members of the company, from our customers, and also from the village. And that was a major step toward making sure that we could implement this wind farm against or mitigating some of the resistance that other developers were experiencing in the area. So I think public buy-in to building infrastructure is absolutely crucial to making this big change. Tyler said earlier, we need to, the transition, what did he say? The transition to renewables needs to be twice as fast as the transition that we've seen with the Industrial Revolution. So the challenge is big, and we're here to help.
And I would say the other important piece is doing it right at the outset, because if you leave a bad taste in people's mouths, it can take a really long time to recover from things. So, you know, example with some technology like CFLs, it seems like the technology never really was fantastic. A lot of people had a really adverse reactions to the color, temperature, and flickering, and you know the CFLs were never great. And LEDs never really had those technological challenges. It was kind of, I think they waited maybe a little bit for the technology to be more mature, and they never really left that bad taste in people's mouths that kind of hindered their adoption, for example. So I think that lesson relates to a lot of things. You got to do it right, and you know, with you know, when you're dealing with communities, for example, as well, you don't want to get on their bad side. You don't want to you don't want people to have a negative perception of this technology that can take time to overcome.
That's a really good point. Yeah. So taking people with you right from the start. I'm going to say that that's an issue of, well, branding maybe, where if certain entities plan an infrastructure project and then don't get people on board from the start, they've missed their chance to establish a positive branding.
Yeah, it has something to do with branding. And also, I think it's just anything that's new to us, we also tend to question. So there's kind of our brain just develops these connections early on with something that's new and foreign, right? So it's helpful to make sure that those connections are positive, because if they aren't, then you're going to have a hard time overcoming it.
Yeah, yeah. Does your company do kind of stakeholder analysis or public perception analysis, and do you take that into account in your projects?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it depends on the project, I would say. There's very often a consultation component to our projects. It depends who we're consulting with, depending on the project. We might be consulting more on the kind of manufacturer distributor end versus consumer end, depending on the project. I know that we do a lot of program implementation in general on behalf of utilities, especially in the US. And there's a pretty heavy marketing component in our work, and just understanding public perception and kind of the barriers that we need to tackle. It was about 5 or 6 years ago. We've always had a marketing component to our work, but we had one of the acquisitions that we made was acquiring a company called Olson that has offices across North America that kind of bolster our marketing presence. So there's a lot of non-energy work that they do. I think they were doing some marketing for the NHL and, you know, lotto corporations in various provinces and things like that. But it's really helpful to have an ad agency that can target public perception in the energy space as well.
Interesting. I actually have a question for you about one of the points you touched on earlier that's unrelated to the marketing piece, but are graduate students with their ability to research and to do and computational skills, are they well equipped to go into the consulting business?
I think so. It depends exactly what you're doing in terms of the modeling. I think it helps if you're doing some research perhaps that's funded by another company, because that's kind of a more that might be closer to the ground in terms of the modeling techniques that they actually use. I know as part of my master's, it was a little bit more on the experimental side in terms of, CF, finite element modeling, which unless you get into some sort of aerospace company or something like that, there aren't many companies that would do similar type of modeling. So I guess it really depends on the research and the tools that you're using, but it definitely helps to be exposed and have that mindset.
Yeah, understandably so. Does that mean if people know that they want to leave academia after graduate studies and perhaps go into the consulting world, is it a good idea to make sure that your topic aligns with hot topics in the consulting world, heat pumps, electrification, things like that?
Yeah, definitely. It's I think so. I think I would say it's a very good idea, and we have a pretty. There's lots of consultants that we have that have gone through and done their masters. There's a surprising number that have gone through and done their PhDs as well. I always had the impression that most people that were doing their PhDs ended up in academia, and that's obviously not the case.
In your case, how related was your work then when you entered ICF to your actually graduate studies?
Yeah, it wasn't very related. I mean, my experience with my master's overall definitely helped in terms of getting that the background. What I probably enjoyed the most at IESVic was all the courses we had to take and all of the background that we received in terms of the energy system and the various pieces and understanding things overall. The experience of writing my thesis and doing modeling and stuff helped, especially the thesis, I would say, because it's something that is put under a lot of scrutiny, a lot of editing. You need to make sure that it's and perhaps it's moving into peer-reviewed journals at that point. So the experience of writing and authoring was definitely very helpful for consulting, because the communication skills are really important in consulting.
Yeah, that's a good point to touch upon. I think the experience of writing about your research really makes you think about the modeling work that you've done. And in my experience, that really helps you understand your own work.
Right. And I think during my master's is when I got over the hump of really being comfortable with presenting, for example. So that was useful exposure to, whether it was presenting at various talks at the university or at conferences or other sessions.
Yeah, I would second that. The learning how to display information, making kind of figures which are accessible to other people, as well as presenting, is kind of the biggest, I'd say, skills I learned from the master's program.
Yeah. Tom, you're joining us from Delft. It's now late there. I believe it's what is it? 11:25? 10:25?
10:25. Yeah.
Okay. I hope we're not keeping you away from a well-rested sleep.
I'll leave in a few minutes, but it's not very often I get to digitally be in Victoria, so.
How do you find the research culture, or is there a difference between the research culture at Delft or in Europe in general, in comparison to here?
I think in Delft in general, we're quite close to the port of Rotterdam, and just all of our research is much more integrated into industry. We just very frequently have kind of public consultations at the university level. You very frequently have someone say, hey, can I stop by and just chat about your research for an hour? Whereas I felt like when I was at EnVic, but also even in Toronto, it was you'd be pulling teeth to kind of talk to anyone in policy or industry. But here it's much more common. I mean, we usually have an annual conference, and the Minister of Economic Affairs, just on our small subtopic, will usually come in and give a talk. So here it seems a much more integrated in the academic society. But that also means that there's a lot less fundamental research, I would say, as well. It's more like technical universities as compared to more general research and general universities. So pros and cons depending on if you're in an engineering field or not.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that may have changed actually in my personal experiences. We, since my time here at IESVic, has been very integrated with policymakers and also with industry. Perhaps that is a shift that's being pursued here in Victoria. But I know what you mean in Europe. Being from Europe myself, I know that it's going to industry, calling somebody up and saying, hey, can we go for a coffee and talk about a project is there's less of a barrier. I find there's more integration between industry and academia, at least in my experience.
Yeah.
Interesting. I don't want to hog everybody's time. If anybody else has got questions, we've still got I think 16 participants online here. Feel free to ask away.
I see a question here from Harshan. He was asking if my company has a sustainability target, like X tons of emissions reduced through practice, or achieving carbon neutrality. I hear some companies aim for certified B corporation. Yeah, I know we offset our energy consumption through credits, so we're a carbon neutral company. At least in the U.S. We used to do that in Canada. We have our sustainability team. I mean, the reason that most of us are involved in this space is because we want to make a difference. So it's definitely important to make sure that we are kind of walking the walk, I guess. And most of our offices are, we try to, as much as possible, to move into like LEED certified and other similar certification type, sustainable buildings. So I would say our biggest contribution is probably through supporting other companies with their sustainability goals. But yeah, we try to do as much as we can to support or to kind of mitigate our own impacts.
I think Theo has a question.
Yeah, I'd like to thank the speakers. It was awesome to see lots of overlap and everything between what I'm doing right now. I'm kind of moving into that consultancy space myself this summer. I've kind of got a job that I will be paid for outside of anything else, but it's just sort of like a thing. I don't know if that's going to be something that I will follow through on and build a career off.
That's news.
Yeah, one of the things that I enjoyed, and I'd love to hear McKenzie say something about this. You had all these bubbles up, and one of them was diversity is key. Could you elaborate a bit more on that? What do you mean with diversity? And like I'm thinking more like a diverse background. Is that what you mean with that, or how do we interpret that, and why do you think that's key?
Yeah, so I think in terms of background, your background, the people you're going to be working with, their background, as well as leadership within the company. So if you're thinking about like going to interview at a consulting firm, I think it's really important to look at like every band of the company and see just what it looks like. Is it mostly old men? If it is, that might be a sign that you maybe don't want to work there. I think it's really important, and I've noticed it, and it's one of the reasons I've been at 3 different companies, is that, you know, you tend to have a more collaborative workspace, a workspace with, you know, a wide diversity of thoughts and ideas and backgrounds. It really does make for the best kind of solutions. And it also is really great for kind of early career professionals, because if you're reporting up to, you know, a lot of people that look and think and have the same kind of background, you know, they all look the same, you know, you're not going to get as many new ideas. And so, you know, I just think it's really important, and especially, you know, it tells a lot of the companies thinking about those kinds of things that, you know, they're thinking about your career and what's best for you too. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I totally agree with that. You need a culture fit to enjoy your, and I think that comes like find your joy. You need a culture fit to really enjoy your work.
Right. Find your joy.
Another thing is you said find a mentor, and this is also one of the things you really stressed. Do you have any like advice in like who do you approach, and maybe why do you approach them? Like, do you have anything sort of abstract ideas around like that? The whole idea of finding this person, maybe selecting this person, reaching out to this person.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it can be a lot of different things. For me, I have looked to people who, you know, maybe have experienced similar things as me. You know, being a woman in a, you know, very technical field, I work with mostly men. And so I think it's been really helpful for me to have, you know, a woman who has, you know, done it before. So I can go to her with, you know, questions about like, you know, what do I do when this person's not listening to me? And like, do you have any thoughts on, you know, how can I take up more space in a room so that I'm not being talked over all the time? You know, these are things that kind of affect me on my day-to-day. So I think, you know, if it's somebody who has had a career trajectory that you think is really interesting and you'd like to model yours after, I think that's important. But I think anybody who's, you know, really interested in you and keen in helping you grow, I think is kind of the most important.
Thanks.
That's a really interesting thought, McKenzie. Do you have, sorry to put you on the spot here, but do you have somebody who you're looking up to, who you're, or have you found somebody who you're trying to model your career after?
Do. So I actually, it's the reason I've just taken this new job at Edison Energy, because I followed her to this company. So yes, I do. And I think it kind of makes like the world of difference, at least in my career it has. Having somebody that, you know, gives you opportunities and, you know, believes in your capabilities is everything.
Oh, that's fantastic to hear. Great. And you just started this Monday, right?
I did just start this Monday. Yeah.
Oh, nice, nice, exciting.
Yeah. Well,
we're 35 minutes over time now. I'm happy to keep this going. I see we still have a couple of people online. I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but you know, throughout my time at IESVic, I've spoken to a couple of the people that I still see here that are still in the list of participants. Brian, I don't know if you're still there.
Oh yeah.
But, fantastic, great. So we once had a conversation about the costs of the prices of electricity in California, and we were talking about infrastructure development earlier, and from what I remember, you told me if BC Hydro is now providing backup power to California through the right of way with transmission line that BC Hydro holds, and you also said that if you could build a transmission line quickly, at least I think you said that if you can build it quickly, you could make a lot of money right now, but nobody's doing that because it's building a transmission line just takes a long time. do I remember that correctly? That it's really a barrier of building transmission just because it takes such a long time. You can't plan 10 years into the future, and that's why nobody's doing it.
So let me answer that question in a number of ways. In the first instance, we are providing services to California right now, and we have for many years. But as they move towards more requirements for reserves and for capacity, we're doing that, and we're able to do so, through our system, and that provides clean energy to California for backup purposes, for reserve purposes, and the like. Having more transmission is always a good thing. It's difficult to build transmission pretty well anywhere in North America because of to acquire that right of way. That's the first thing. The second thing is, the cost of incremental transmission is not inexpensive, to say the least. So I haven't seen any new transmission of consequence between the Pacific Northwest and the Desert Southwest for quite a number of years. I've had a number of people approach me or my colleagues at PowerX and say, well, what would happen if another 1,000 megawatts was built? And the answer is, as long as it's competitive, the market would take it. Folk would sign up for it almost certainly. But I've seen transmission projects that all they would do is get us to a point of congestion in the Pacific Northwest and not get through that point of congestion, for example. It's complex. It's very complex. There's a number of different states, jurisdictions one has to get through to get to the Desert Southwest, which is where people tend to want to go, into California. But I don't know if I've answered it. I guess I've been just going on here for a minute. I hope I've answered some of your question.
No, absolutely. The reason I'm asking this is because one of the big constraints, obviously, in British Columbia is the amount of capacity that's available, dispatchable capacity specifically. And with the push for electrification, the electricity demand increasing, or the peak demand increasing in winter time, is a difficult challenge to solve. And I'm wondering whether reliance on more transmission with California that is summer peaking, where the load is summer peaking, may be a way to increase our ability to accommodate that higher winter peak load here. I know that goes into all sorts of aspects around energy security, especially going across the border. But I'm wondering whether you see transmission being a solution to the capacity problem that we face here in BC.
So we're gonna once Site C is built, there's going to be 1,100 megawatts of incremental capacity. That's a fair bit, and that also means the existing system will be able to be utilized in a more efficient fashion. So I wouldn't say that transmission would be perhaps helpful for capacity. Incremental transmission would help us import energy that's low cost during times when there's excess energy in the marketplace, and often that excess energy comes when there's a surfeit of renewable energy, whether it's blowing a lot or whether there's a lot of solar energy during the day, during the spring or in the fall. And we could take that energy back into clean energy back into British Columbia, store it here, and then sell it at some point when it's more valuable or provided to BC Hydro's ratepayers. But the issue of capacity is really, in my view anyway, a British Columbia issue. And once Site C is built, a good portion of capacity requirements in the short run to medium run will be dealt with, maybe even longer run. This question is better put to my colleagues and friends at BC Hydro in terms of, they're in the midst of coming up with a long-term plan that extends out to 2040. But at the end of the day, the beauty of the hydroelectric system is it affords a fair amount of capacity.
Mm.
I want to bring something to your attention too before I forget. You asked a question a couple of days ago about what other jurisdictions are doing, or what jurisdictions are doing, period, vis-a-vis renewable power and electric car charging. And as it turns out, it was your timing couldn't be better of your question, because Tesla announced yesterday, I don't know if you saw it or not, that at their superchargers, which is their high-speed charging network, and they've got thousands of them across Canada and America, by the end of 2021, the electricity that comes out of those superchargers will be 100% renewable. So how they're doing it, I don't know. They haven't announced that yet. Tesla, since they're in the solar business, I'd be very surprised if this would be a matter of just buying offsets. I wouldn't be surprised if this was a function of them owning generation and selling it into the grid. But anyway, it's good news in that if you were, historically buying energy from a supercharger, say in Saskatchewan or Alberta, where the grid intensity is higher than in British Columbia or Quebec or Manitoba, you were stuck with that grid intensity in your car for a supercharger, not for home deliveries, but for a supercharger. And superchargers are what Tesla owners use to charge up on the road. So I think pretty good news.
That is good news. Yeah. For the other audience members, the reason why that came up is because here in British Columbia we don't really have a choice. If you live in Kelowna, you're buying electricity from FortisBC. If you live outside of Kelowna, you're pretty much buying it from BC Hydro. But in Germany, for example, if you buy a Tesla or other electric cars, other companies have partnered with individual utilities that supply renewable electricity to you then. But yeah, like you said, superchargers are usually used on the road, and there you don't have access to who provides that electricity. So Tesla being able to go into Canada and provide their superchargers with electricity from renewable sources across the country must actually be a regulatory feat. Just planning that in all the different jurisdictions must have been quite a complex undertaking. So thanks.
Well, time will tell how they actually do it. But they just sort of tweeted it out yesterday kind of quietly. And we picked up on it through some of our news feeds and dug a little deeper. And what we have so far is just their announcement rather than how they're going to accomplish it. But I really would be very surprised if they wouldn't do it in a very fulsome fashion. That's just the way they are. They're in that business. So they're in the solar business.
Yeah, interesting. I do have another question for you. I'm sorry to put you on the spot here.
Okay, but I can't answer it. I'll say
that. BC Hydro's trading arm, PowerX, trades a large amount of electricity across the border. But as far as I understand, the majority of PowerX's revenue actually comes from firming power and shaping power down in the United States, where power doesn't necessarily actually transit through the intertie. First of all, is that correct?
It's fair to say that the most of the energy that we trade comes from outside of the system. We're buying in the Pacific Northwest and selling into California, or buying in California, selling into Arizona, buying and selling natural gas, buying and selling renewable products, firming and shaping. So it's a combination of blocks of energy. It's a combination of capacity sales and RA sales. It's a combination of all those things which make up our business. But it's fair to say that a very large portion of our business is energy that we've bought and sold outside of BC. We obviously we're very lucky. We're fortunate being the wholly owned arm of BC Hydro, energy marketing arm of BC Hydro. We buy BC Hydro's surplus electricity, and we sell them electricity that we buy at low prices, and that heads straight to ratepayers. So the value proposition is a pretty darn good one to ratepayers. And then the money we make in the Pacific Northwest and elsewhere, anywhere in America for that matter, or Alberta, also rolls back up to BC Hydro's ratepayers.
That's actually a really interesting point that I was quite surprised to learn about when I first came to BC, that PowerX's trading activities actually lower the electricity price for ratepayers here.
That's right.
in BC, and you said it's quite substantial, right? It's somewhere in the
That's right. It's 150 to 200 million dollars, roughly, on an annual basis. Obviously the profitability varies year to year, but the bottom line is that it's a pretty healthy contribution to BC Hydro's ratepayers. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's interesting, and that means that revenue, because the majority of that is actually made by trading electricity within the United States, is actually not from imports and exports, but just the ability of PowerX to trade in the US is based on the dispatchability of the BC Hydro system that can back up any contracts that you make. Do I understand that correctly?
Almost. I mean, the money that we make is from buying and selling wholesale electricity, natural gas, renewable products in the United States, also from buying BC Hydro surplus electricity and selling it, and buying energy on behalf of BC Hydro when it's inexpensive. So it's all of that contributes to our overall profitability. We also, of course, something that people forget from time to time is that, BC Hydro has an open access tariff for its high voltage transmission system, and we, rent those wires on a fair basis with other parties that are interested in accessing those wires. And many years that contribution to BC Hydro's ratepayers can be $25-30 million or more. We also market the Canadian entitlement to downstream benefits, which is owned by the government, and the profit that is made from that flows back to the government. So, the Canadian entitlement, which fell out of the Columbia River Treaty starting back in 1965, initially was dollars, and today is electricity. The amount of electricity is equivalent to about 5 to 550 megawatts, average megawatts around the clock, and somewhat more in capacity, something like 1,200 megawatts or so of capacity. This varies on an annual basis based on what Bonneville is able to provide us under the treaty. But that's another product that we sell, but that money goes back to the government who owns that product. And since you and I are the government, that means less taxes to collect from you and I as well. Yeah. It's an interesting value proposition that we have, as a Crown corporation doing what we do.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about, especially for us as energy system modelers, where we have to capture the transition going forward, and with energy demand increasing, building new variable renewables that will impact the dispatchability of the BC Hydro system, and how that then in turn impacts the trading arm, the PowerX ability to make those trades in the US is something that I have personally not yet understood fully, and I think there's a lot of research that can be done in that realm of how this whole energy transition actually then will impact ratepayers here in BC through PowerX's change in business model. I'm not going to use the word change in business model, but change in practices, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's an evolution, really, is what it comes down to. Is when I look at what we sold 20 odd years ago when I first started with PowerX, it was very simple, not very complex products. And today, customers are asking for clean products, for example. They're asking for emission-free products. They're asking for, backup to variable and intermittent products and the like. So things have changed dramatically. The important thing to understand in terms of how an export is made from British Columbia is the ratepayer in British Columbia comes first. So the only way an export can be made is if the ratepayers' requirements in British Columbia here are first dealt with. So reliability of the system is never compromised, never sacrificed for that export to take place. So that's something which is really important. And so you can look at it in one way, saying it's sort of an asymmetric model where we get the energy when it's available to us, and then we take that energy and market it, and then basically hand the money back to BC Hydro, and then BC Hydro can do what it wants with it, but currently it hands it to ratepayers.
Yeah, makes sense.
It's very cool.
I'm totally hogging the screen time here. Ron has to leave us. Thanks for coming, Ron. I know people are joining from all over the world. If anybody else has questions, please feel free to jump in here. Otherwise, while I have you, Brian, it's always fascinating to talk to you. I'm kind of jumping all over topics here, but I'm wondering, I just recently learned a bit about the big power failure that happened in Texas, and I know that ERCOT has its own integrated system that runs, as far as I understand, on a separate frequency than the rest of North America. So it's not directly connected. Was BC Hydro or PowerX at all involved in when the power went out in Texas? When there was a big constraint on power?
So that's interesting. It's an interesting question. Over the years, we have transacted in almost everywhere in North America. The one place we didn't transact was ERCOT, and the reason we didn't do it was it is virtually isolated from the rest of North America. The connections with ERCOT and the surrounding regions are relatively weak, and you're correct. It's not synchronized with areas outside of ERCOT. It also has rules that are quite a bit different from a trading perspective than the rest of North America. So we looked at it, and from a risk-adjusted basis, we saw no real upside for us to get there. The price of energy popped in areas around ERCOT, and as we're buying and selling energy, like all other trading companies and marketing companies, there's upside and downside when prices go up and go down. But we weren't directly involved because we don't do business in ERCOT.
Makes sense, yeah. And they also have I think a ceiling of I believe it's $10,000 a megawatt hour.
I believe so. I can't confirm it because I used to be more familiar with ERCOT when we looked at it and thought that we were going to potentially participate, but their ceiling's pretty high. But I don't recall if it is 10,000 or not.
Okay, yeah. It's an interesting case study because what happened there was that it just got cold all of a sudden in the entire region. They tried to get all their generators online, but generators started tripping because of under frequency, and the market price just shot up to the ceiling, and then it's just stayed there for hours at a time, and nothing else would come online. So the way that normally works, then if there's too much demand and too little supply, that there are rolling brownouts where well, I guess they're rolling blackouts because they're unplanned, but usually what happens is you take individual circuits offline for a certain period of time, and then you kind of roll over so that all customers get affected evenly. But the problem there was that the emergency circuits that had to stay online, hospitals and things like that, were the only ones that were basically still online, and other customers who weren't in those emergency circles they couldn't go onto a rolling basis, that just because there was no extra supply to go around, and that caused a huge problem there. And they were literally minutes away from a total blackout of the system, which would have required a black start, and they managed to avoid that just barely. So it's a fascinating example of what happens if there isn't enough supply. So
lots went wrong at the same time. The natural gas wellheads froze up, and ERCOT gets much of its capacity from gas-fired generation. If those wells froze and you couldn't move natural gas from the wells through the pipeline system and into gas-fired generation, you have a problem there as well. So there were so many things that went wrong at the same time. I mean, it's going to be studied for years. I mean, just like the California energy crisis of 20 years ago, it's still being studied. And contractually, there's regulators are going to undo contracts almost certainly, even if they were bona fide contracts, as a function of prices going through the ceiling. And I'm sure you heard the same anecdotal stories as I did, where people that were paying hundreds of dollars a month for electricity ended up paying tens of thousands of dollars a month for electricity. Seems incomprehensible, but if they had a contract with a third-party provider, which there was a flow through of wholesale costs, they would be exposed. So time will tell if that all sticks or not, and what was learned from the ERCOT experience. But wow, it was a disaster for sure.
Yeah, there's a great video on it by a YouTube channel, Practical Engineering, on the ERCOT disaster. It's about 20 minutes long. I love that video because he goes into a lot of detail of what exactly happened. But yeah, freezing up of natural gas. The statement that natural gas is the cheapest capacity that you could build is true. But if that fails you in the dead of winter, boy, that's a problem.
Exactly. I mean, it's as you know, natural gas generation is pretty well over all of North America where you don't have hydro. It's the marginal source of generation, and it's also the baseload form of generation. Many parts of North America. So, this is a rare event, of course. Normally doesn't get that cold in ERCOT, to say the least. But gas is inexpensive, but it failed in ERCOT under rare, outstanding conditions.
Yeah. Well, we are slowly diminishing here in crowd size. This has been fantastic. I really enjoyed talking to the presenters who have, I believe, all left. Brian, it's been great talking to you. It's always a pleasure to hear your experience. Well, I think we should probably call it a day.